you know it or not, you're here as part of what we call the Wisconsin Lakes Partnership. The Wisconsin Lakes Partnership is a 50-year strategy of trying to take care of too many lakes. The problem with Wisconsin is that we don't just have 3 or 4 lakes that we could focus on, we have thousands of lakes, and it makes it really hard to herd all of them. And 50 years ago, the strategy was developed that said, you know what, shoreline property owners have a vested interest in their lakes. We need to motivate them and organize them to be partners in this. So lake associations and lake districts are a key part of it. The university is part of this because we do outreach and education on a regular basis through extension, through your local extension offices, through regional extension educators. And then the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources is a key part of this. They have the statutory and the constitutional obligation to take care of those thousands of lakes, but they have nowhere near the financial and personnel capacity, unfortunately. I came across a statistic just the other day online. Someone pointed out that when you compare 1997, most of you were around 1997, when you compare 1997 to today, before adjusting for inflation, the DNR's budget is 40% smaller than it was in 1997. So 40% less money before adjusting for inflation. So they are increasingly relying on county governments and nonprofits and lake districts and other groups to pick up the work. Mike Engelson, you'll hear from in a minute. He's also part of that Lakes Partnership that I mentioned. He represents sort of all of you, if you're part of a lake association or a lake district, sort of collectively to organize. So thank you all for being part of the Wisconsin Lakes Partnership. It's the only reason why our lakes are really in the good condition that they're in. If you're on a lake that you're saying it has milfoil or it has water quality problems, believe me, it could be worse. Mike, maybe he'll mention this, he lives in Iowa now. And Iowa water resources are definitely neglected and under a lot of pressure. Before getting too lost here, I guess I will just introduce Mike. We'll get things started with the policy picture. Mike and I have been working together now for coming up on 14 years. He started out at Wisconsin Lakes really as more of a membership coordinator. And before that, he was with the River Alliance. We're going to hear from somebody from River Alliance later on. And Mike is now almost pretty much the only staff person at Wisconsin Lakes. Do I have that right? And so he's trying to hold that organization together where there's too many lakes and too many organizations. But he does keep his finger on the pulse of what's happening in policy. So we're going to get some updates from him. So please give a warm Northwoods welcome to Mike Engelson.
Thank you, Eric. And yeah, it is nice to come back to the land of cleaner waters. Like, we have lots of problems in Wisconsin, but talk to me later if you want to hear about Iowa. I am still, even though I'm in Iowa, moved with my partner who took a job at Iowa Healthcare. So I'm living in Iowa, but I am still deeply connected to Wisconsin. I like to think of my little bedroom office as sort of the Wisconsin embassy. So I would go through that door. I do have to admit I'm kind of a Hawkeye fan now. Yeah, that's what I wanted. Wisconsin Lakes, I know many of you here are members, or your lake organization are members, and thank you for your continued support for that. If you're not familiar with us, these are the kind of things we do. One of the things is advocate for sound science-based water policy in the state, so that's what I'm going to be talking about today, kind of giving you an update about what's happened over the last year and maybe think a little bit about what's going to come in the future. If you are inclined to join or donate, wisconsinlakes.org, you can talk to me later. So the very short, this is actually a shorter version of the presentation I gave on this at the Lakes and Rivers Convention back in April. The really short version of what has happened in water policy in the state over the last year is not much. Like, there just has not been this legislature, and the fact that we have a Democratic governor and a Republican-controlled legislature makes the legislation that moves forward tends to fall into very small buckets. There's not a whole lot that gets passed because of the difference in parties. And water and environmental legislation has just not been a real strong feature of this legislature. So we'll talk about a handful of bills, but there was not a whole lot that was going on. I do also think it's helpful to start these talks with a check-in as to where we are in the legislative timeline. So the legislature meets in a 2-year increment. The last legislature, my pointer go over there, Park, started back in January of 2023. For all intents and purposes, it's done now. They wrapped up legislation in, I think it was the late February, early March. And there's almost certainly will be no more bills passed. They could get called back into session by either leadership or by the governor, but very unlikely that will happen, and extremely unlikely that there will be anything that would be of interest in a water-related capacity. So we're essentially done with this session. Everyone is off to run their re-election campaigns. So the Assembly will be completely re-elected, the Senate half of it. We'll talk about that at the end. One of the important things, though, is that the very first thing that a new legislature does is work on the state budget. So the fiscal biennium for the budget for the state will end on June 30th of next year. So most of the first part of next year will be dealing with the budget. So as I said, not much for 2024. Few things to talk about. Election year coming up with some potential for some big changes. I'll talk about that at the end. There are still some bills being introduced. They're not going to get acted on. I'll talk about that a little bit. We'll talk about the legislation that did happen. And then there's already work that has been started on the state budget. So all of the state agencies, including DNR, have already put together or are in the midst of putting together their request to the governor for what their agency would like to see in the budget that the governor will introduce probably in February or early March. So a lot of these decisions are actually already underway. So I've divided this into 3 sections. We've got things that passed the legislature but were vetoed by the governor, and then things that didn't pass at all. And there's a couple of bills in each category. This isn't exhaustive. There were a few other things that had to do with water, but these were the ones that were probably the most important given the time constraints. I'll just go through these quickly and you can ask me questions at the end. So the first one, Act 5, this was way back in 2023, that opened the Surface Water Grant Program to producer-led councils. Producer-led councils are groups of farmers or other ag interests that get together and work usually on developing some sort of sustainable or regenerative agriculture programs for farmers in that area. That obviously, they do that for it can be cost savings, it's good for soil health, but it's also good for water quality. And so what this bill did was allow those entities, there are some other conservation entities besides lake and river organizations that can apply for surface water grants to qualify for them. They still have to be the same sort of project, so it has to relate to lake protection or lake management or river management or something like that. And the thought here, we were in support of this bill, the hope is that this will help drive some collaboration on a watershed scale to bring some good projects into being. The other one that might apply to you, how many of you are here from lake districts? There's quite a few. So you may already know this. For the official notices that lake districts have to give, there's I think 3 or 4 different categories where things like information about the tax assessment and those sorts of things. Those sorts of official notices can now be delivered by email instead of by print, but the person that's getting the email has to have opted into that system. So it's not like you can just get rid of your mailings unless you get everyone to agree to provide you with an email. The reason for that, that caveat to that piece of legislation was so that these are very important notices, obviously. That's why they're official notices, and especially in terms of taxes and things like that. You want to make sure that people get the information, and email is a little less consistent a delivery method. You know, if there's an address and you have that address, then that's probably the safest way to make sure the majority of people get noticed. But this does provide another layer of ways to get the information out about annual meetings, special meetings, and the assessment and that sort of stuff. In terms of things that passed but the governor vetoed, the aquatic plant management bill has come up for a couple of sessions now. This would have changed the the way the aquatic plant management program in the state was described in the statute, sort of its scope, moving it more from one that where the language talked about working towards sort of holistic management of a natural community of plants to really being focused on aquatic invasive species eradication. The meat of the bill would have changed the definition of private pond so that it was slightly less onerous permitting requirements to do, oftentimes providing permit exemptions in a larger number of water bodies for chemical applications. That would have included, it would have, I think currently ponds are at 5 acres, it would have moved that definition up to 10 acres, and it would have allowed there to be multiple properties on that water body and still would not need notice or a permit requirement. And I think the language was if the bill could, if there was a connection to another water body, so some sort of hydrologic connection, if there was an outflow into a stream or something like that, if that connection could be stopped, then it would be okay to do the permit, to do the chemical application without a permit. We were opposed to the bill, DNR was opposed to the bill, and another number of other conservation groups were sort of on that line. I think everybody understands that the definition of private pond could probably be tinkered with. It's very, very tight and narrow right now. But we did not, we're not in favor of that bill, and it was passed, but it was vetoed by the governor. The other bill was one that would have provided implementation language for money to do PFAS mitigation that was set aside in the budget in 2023. I can't remember the exact figure. It was a fairly sizable chunk of change that was allocated in the budget, but how that money could be spent was left out. They had to do separate legislation. There's a whole story of why that happened. I talked about that last year. I won't go into that this year. But the bill that was introduced then to provide implementation for those funds, most conservation groups felt that it was too favorable to industry and to the people who were doing polluters, providing a lot of protections against future lawsuits or incurring other costs, and not as helpful to the people that are actually impacted by PFAS. And so there was a lot of work to try to get a compromise, but it never happened. The bill was passed by the legislature, and the governor then vetoed it. Both of these bills, there were attempts to override the vetoes, but they failed. And then there were a couple of bills that did not pass that are worth talking about. I'll talk about this one first. By the way, for those of you who don't know, PFAS are they're often called forever chemicals. They're used in things like fire retardant. I know some of you in this area are probably all too familiar with PFAS, and we'll be hearing more about that in the upcoming talks. What this bill would have done, there was a administrative rulemaking by DNR that would have set groundwater standards for how much PFAS is safe to be in groundwater. Because that rulemaking would have caused the regulated community of that rule, I believe it's like $10 million, more than $10 million over a 2-year period. I think I have that number right. That triggers what's called the RAINS Act. I don't remember RAIN stands for, but basically that says that if that economic threshold is going to be in place, the rulemaking automatically stops. It stops in its tracks. The agency cannot go any farther until there is either they change the rules so it doesn't have that impact, or there is a separate statute enacted by the legislature authorizing that rulemaking. So it's a break on expensive to the regulated community regulations. This was an attempt to get that bill passed that would have started that process, and it did not pass. And then I'm guessing a few of you in the room have heard about this whole wake issue. I don't know a whole lot about it, but nothing has passed. There's no state legislation that has passed. There was a bill introduced by Senator Felskowski and Representative Swearingen that would have limited wake sports to, prohibited them within 200 feet of shore. And there were some other conditions on that as well. Most of us who are working on this that are in favor of some level of regulation of the sport believed that did not go anywhere near far enough. Many of you may have attended public hearings and listening sessions, and that bill was stopped. There was some activity that was trying to move towards a compromise, but it did not pass. It never actually even got voted out of committee, so the legislature never even took it up on the floor. There was also a bill introduced by Senator Jacques that would have banned wake sports or creation of enhanced wakes on lakes 1,500 acres or smaller. I believe there were some other conditions on that one as well. That bill was never even introduced in the assembly. It was introduced late in the session, so it could have gotten a hearing and maybe could have gotten rushed through if there had been a lot of backing of it by the legislative leadership. There was not, in general, you don't very often see bills on the same issue introduced by legislators of the same party that compete with each other. So there was, it was going to be hard for that bill to be passed in the first place. So neither of those happened. There were a few other things. The shoreline zoning law was introduced by Representative Shankland. That would have restored things to the pre-2015 scheme where counties could pass shoreline zoning ordinances with standards stronger than the state minimum standards. There was also another bill introduced by Senator Felskowski that called for some wakeboat studies to be conducted by UW. Both of those were actually introduced after the legislature finished their sessions, so there was no chance that they were going to pass. The reason you see on a number of different issues, you see bills like that introduced, and there may still be a few that get introduced this year even. The reason legislators do that is because, for a number of reasons. It could be, in the case of Katrina Shankland's bill, she wanted to make sure that this issue stays out there. It was not probably going to ever pass in the legislature anyway, but this puts that statutory language out there as a possibility, keeps it in the mind of legislators as they go into the next session, and so it's kind of a way to help keep the ball rolling for a longer term campaign to try to get some of those protections back. The wakeboat study bill, I think part of that was done to maybe appease some constituents. Oftentimes these bills are done just so that somebody that would like to see that bill introduced, at least the legislator can say that they're introduced. If you want to be really, really pessimistic, you could say that sometimes legislators just introduce them so that they can say, I introduced this bill, it's not my fault it didn't pass, even though it was introduced in August and the last bill was passed back in March, something like that. There was also one that had something to do with banning PFAS in commercial products. Some of you may be familiar and have heard about all the efforts that went into the Wisconsin Conservation Congress, especially related to the enhanced wake issue. Congress is a statutorily created entity that holds hearings every spring. Citizens submit questions that are then put to the people at the hearings and now online as well. So there were a number of wake sports related questions that were introduced. Those all passed overwhelmingly. These hearings are largely, the Conservation Congress has largely been sort of a hook and bullet, sportsmen, hunters and anglers. Those are the sorts of folks that tend to participate in these. May have been a little bit different this year, especially in the last couple of years since they've gone to the online voting. Opens it up to more people, and we and Last Wilderness Alliance and other groups that were working on the wake boat issue definitely let people know that those questions were out there and encouraged them to participate. I think the boating industry probably did the same. So it was maybe a broader audience that participated in that this year than has in the past. But regardless, the questions as to whether or not things should be regulated regarding to wake sports passed pretty overwhelmingly. The thing to note is that these are advisory only. So these questions will go through some more process within the Congress. Eventually will likely be put into reports that go to DNR and go to legislators. Legislators are not obligated to create legislation. So because this stuff passed, does not mean that there will be a bill with these terms. It just means that legislators will get something that say, the Congress is really in favor of it. That's not something to, that's huge, that's big. But I know some people have expressed to me that their understanding was that this was creating legislation, and that's not the case. But we should still be, if you're inclined towards wake sports regulation, this is some pretty powerful messaging. I did not put a slide in, but I will mention, as Eric mentioned, DNR and some of their struggles. It is worth pointing out, we still do not have a DNR secretary. The last secretary left, when was that?
I don't remember.
Yeah, it's long enough that I don't remember. It was last year, right? Yeah. So we don't have a new secretary appointed. I am not sure why. That's the first obvious question. So I don't have any inside information to pass along on that. I don't know if there is one coming, though I would guess that there may be some waiting on the administration's part to see what happens in the November election. DNR secretaries have been notoriously difficult to get approved. They can get appointed, but they don't always pass the muster of the legislature. So we're kind of in a wait-and-see mode. My experience working with DNR, working with people in the front office, the current deputy secretary is the acting secretary. His name is Stephen Little. He's doing the best I think he can. He, is limited in his ability to set new policy because he's not appointed and doesn't want to, make decisions for that when a secretary is actually appointed has to deal with. But he's doing his best to try to keep things going. It is a challenging, as Eric pointed out, with the financing in the agency. The finances of the agency make it very, very, very difficult. So that's something that we will definitely be looking at in the budget next year. So last thing I will say is what comes next. Elections are in November. There are lots of issues that you all have that you may be thinking, I want to make sure that I talk to my legislator, whether it's the same person or someone new. We've got new maps, so there are some districts that will be potentially changing. We are hopeful. There are some projections that there may be some shifting to a more a less Republican-dominated assembly. Regardless, I think that one impact of these maps is that they are fairer, and they're more fair in that it will be harder for whatever party you are, if you're elected, to just look to your base that's farther to the right or farther to the left you're going to have to look towards your constituents and maybe govern a little bit more towards the middle again, which I think will be a good thing for the state. But we don't know what those elections, what the results are really going to look like. So it's important for your issues, don't be afraid, keep talking to your current legislator and talk to the candidates and let them know. So if wake sports or shoreline zoning or anything else are your issue, let them know that. And then Wisconsin Lakes will be we're working on, continuing to work on wake sports, revisions to the Lake District law, keep beating the drum on shoreline zoning, and as I said, the state budget. And that's the slightly longer version of, not much. So I don't know how much time we have.
Do you have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions? If someone wants to pose something to Mike? Start in the middle.
It's not a question, but it was $125 million that was being held up. And it's also important to note that that bill did not include a 1310, which would have actually distributed those funds.
Yes.
The fact that the Joint Finance Committee is still holding that money up is not associated to the fact that that bill didn't pass.
Yeah, that money could be released. That's actually a really good point. That money could definitely be released, but the Joint Finance Committee is refusing to do so.
Another comment, staffing at DNR has reduced by a similar amount. In heyday, when I was working at DNR, 3,500 employees, somewhere around 2,200, so
Yeah.
it's a drastic reduction in staff, which makes it difficult to do things, and I agree with you, it's going to require the nonprofits to step up and help.
Right, yeah. So I don't know if you in the back could hear, but he was saying that staffing is reduced at DNR from a high of 3,500 down to around 2,200 at this point. So a lot of pressure on, for those of you who are here from the agency, we empathize.
One more.
Over here.
Mike, your perspective on local ordinances for wake boat effectiveness.
Sure.
Just, you see the whole state. So
Yep.
please.
No matter what our plank, whatever legislation proposals we would be supporting to put out, that absolutely the number one thing that we will not budge on is continued ability for local ordinances to be stronger than the whatever state minimums would be set. I figured that was an easy line. I think it's a very effective way. It's the only way we have right now, right? So until something else happens. And the lakes in Wisconsin are so unique and so different that it's very hard to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution. And so having the ability for local governments that want to pass something like some kind of wake sports ordinance, retaining that ability is extremely important, just as it is to bring that ability back in the realm of shoreline zoning ordinances to the counties. So, yeah.
Just to clarify, so I know I've heard people say that some legislation would be better than nothing, and you're stating that right now it'll be harder for local governments to pass more restrictive regulations. Like if that very loose wake boat bill had passed, that would make it harder for local governments?
I don't think it will, as long as the right bill gets passed, as long as there's the right language in it. There are many places in the statutes where we have minimum state standards and then locals can go stronger than that. Now, the sort of political winds in the last decade have kind of pushed against that in a number of areas, so that's always a concern. But setting some sort of baseline, and then for lakes that really need it, that want to go stronger, great. But I don't think there are definitely ways to write the legislation that will not be problematic.
All right, let's thank Mike again.
Thanks again. It's great to be in the land that actually has lakes. So that's not true. I have a lake like 5 minutes from my house, but
All right. And Mike is sticking around. Mike and I will be here all morning during the break and a little bit after the sessions wrap up if you have specific questions. Next up, we heard a little bit about PFAS from Mike, but now we're going to get a little bit deeper and into the, oh no, I'm sorry, we're doing climate change next. Sorry, scared him right there. Tom was like, what? Noah Latik is joining us from the UW Center for Limnology. He is stationed, he's fortunately stationed at Trout Lake Research Station, where he gets to do a lot of work. He's also, from my understanding, involved in his local lake association, which has had its number of challenges over the last couple of years. So thank you, Noah, for stepping up and volunteering in that regard as well. Mike didn't mention anything about climate change, but there has been a lot of talk at the federal and the state level about this issue. And what we're going to hear now is some of the base science, I think, that explains what we're observing and maybe what we may be seeing in the future. So please give a warm welcome to Noah Latik.
Thank you. It's great to be here. This isn't a meeting that I have attended in the past, and it's fantastic to see so many people here that are all interested and love our lakes throughout the state of Wisconsin, but particularly here in the Northwoods. As a research scientist, this tends to be our very busy time of the year, and so we're actually just starting comprehensive fisheries assessments on a bunch of lakes, and so I was out doing gill netting and pike netting and other things, and I'm going to go home after this and take a nap and go electrofish all night tonight. So I'm typically pretty busy during this time of the year. But I was asked to talk a little bit about climate change today. This isn't going to be a real hard audience, I suspect, to convince you that our climate is changing and that it has impacts on our aquatic ecosystems. So I want to start with sort of my goals. What do I want you guys to get out of my talk today? And so first and foremost is understanding some of the climate change signals that we have in Wisconsin. Second is explore the impact of climate change on the physical dynamics of our aquatic ecosystems. This is where we see it the strongest and where we see it first. Explore linkages between those physical changes that we see in our lakes and the biota that live in them. And I'm going to use walleye. Many people are very, very interested or concerned about walleye. And so I'm going to use walleye as an example. And then maybe what we can think to do to manage for climate change in aquatic ecosystems. How can we adapt to this? Because climate change is not something that we can change here locally. And so our response at a local scale, other than our behaviors that we need to happen at a global scale, our response at a local scale can be how can we adapt, how can we manage our systems to be more resilient to the change that's happening. So, a little data to start this off on our changing climate. So this is the Global Land and Ocean Temperature Index. It's put together by a group with the NASA. And what they've done is they've been calculating these global average back since, or they have data going back to 1880. So we're looking at 160 years, 140 years. And what they did is they averaged the temperatures from 1950 to 1980 and then looked at the difference. So this is an anomaly. And so prior to 1950, most of 1950 to 1980 period, most of the global index of temperatures were negative. So it was cooler. And then as we move forward from 1980, we're seeing this very strong linear direction in increasing temperatures. And actually, in 2023 was the warmest year globally that we have on average. It was 1.17 degrees Celsius, warmer than that 1950 to 1980 time period, or 2.11 degrees, 2.11 degrees Fahrenheit. And so the last 10 years have been the warmest 10 years that we have had on record going back to 1880 at a global scale. And so our temperature over this time period is increasing. Our climate is warming. And that's something that I don't think that most people here are going to recognize and see, and also probably see the impacts of that in the environment that we live in. So what does that mean? This is data looking, satellite data looking at the start of growing season and the end of growing season. So SOS is the start of growing season, and the end of growing season is the EOS. And so what you can see is this is from 1982 to 2011. And so what you can see over that period is, if you look at the center of that peak, or start of a growing season, so think about this, you know, when plants are greening up, things of that sort, is about 3 days per decade. And so 1982, I was actually born in 81, we're talking 4 decades. So we're talking, you know, growing season started by now, if that trend was consistent through them, by about 12 days. So growing season starting about 12 days earlier. And if we look at when it's ending, it's also about a 3 days per decade that the growing season's longer. So that warm summer growing season period, it's happening earlier and it's ending later. That makes sense. Our climate is warming, things are getting warmer, that we're gonna see those base changes in the environment that we live in. And this has consequence for things. Here we're looking at the arrival date in black circles. And so the mean arrival date you can see over here, and the departure date of the northern house martins. This is data for the UK, and you can see here that they're arriving earlier and they're departing later. Makes sense when we go back and think about growing season starting earlier, ending later, that not only are we seeing changes in our physical environment, this is resulting in our biota responding in a similar fashion as well. And so what about Wisconsin? This is data looking at, and so this is for the Center for Climatic Research out of the Nelson Institute in Wisconsin. And what we see for climate change in Wisconsin, it is that it's really our winters that are changing the most. And so this is the December, January, February minimum temperature change from 1950 to 2018. And what you can see, you know, we are sitting right up over in here. What you can see is over that time period that we're in the 6 to 8 degree increase in our minimum temperatures. So the minimum temperatures we see in the winter are increasing substantially. And that's where in Wisconsin, we're actually seeing the most significant impact on our climate is in our winter. You know, this year, I don't know if anybody in here is snowmobiler, but, you know, I'm not, but I've talked to a lot of people and they don't ever remember a time that the snowmobile trails up in northern Wisconsin didn't open. And that happened this year, and this is the first time of that. So our winters are changing. So let's think about climate change, changing winters, and what does that do? This is a group that I was involved with in doing some research on long-term ecological research program sites. And so these are across the United States, Arctic, Antarctic, looking at climate change in forest and aquatic ecosystems. And one of the things that we did is put together this conceptual figure of how climate change impacts the ecosystems that we were interested in it. And I'm not going to go through this, but what I want to emphasize is when you look at it, as you look up at the top, we have increases in greenhouse gases, heat, things like that, and that cascades down through, and it's really complicated. And the other thing is there's these opportunities for feedbacks. It's not just one thing impacts the next thing, impacts the next thing, impacts the next thing, all the way down to the ecosystem services that these ecosystems provide. There's opportunities for these changes to then feed back into those systems. So it is really complicated in terms of teasing apart how climate can impact the ecosystems that we live in, that we use, that we care about, that we love. I'm going to talk a little bit about snow and ice, and I'm also going to delve into, as I said, some of the walleye, the biota responses to those, because those are some of the big ones that we see here in the North Woods. So it's a complicated thing. It takes a lot, and in 20 minutes, it's not something that we can dig entirely into, but there's significant impacts across multiple levels of biological organization that climate change can have an impact on. So this is a recent paper that came out in Nature Reviews, and if folks have heard of Nature as a journal, it's kind of a big deal. And they looked at the global lake response to climate change. And their abstract starts out saying climate change is one of the most severe threats to global lake ecosystems. Lake surface conditions such as ice cover, surface temperature, evaporation, and water level respond dramatically to this threat as observed in recent decades. And so we could extend this to rivers as well. I am a lake scientist, and so you're definitely going to get a lake bias a little bit in what is, but recognizing at a global scale, climate change is a significant threat to our aquatic ecosystems. So I want to switch gears. So that's sort of the first goal that I had, was sort of highlight what climate change looks like in Wisconsin. Second is, how is that impacting our aquatic ecosystems? And so before I get into the impact directly on aquatic ecosystems, I want to say that this isn't just an environmental issue. This is also a human health and human quality issue. So these are colleagues of mine that went and looked at drownings and associated with the minimum temperature in December, January, February, and March, so our winter time period. And what they end up seeing is that the closer our temperatures get to freezing, the more frequent drownings we end up seeing in lakes. And so as we think about our climate moving closer and closer here, there are going to be human health consequences, especially in the variability, and we're not used to it. I mean, how many articles do you guys see? There's just a couple posted over here of people getting trapped and needing to be rescued on the ice. We see that more and more frequently. And so this is also a human health issue in terms of understanding that. And I would say the unpredictability. We're used to decades and centuries that this is what it was. It's changing, and it's not the same anymore. And so it's not just an environmental issue. Climate change is also, from the perspective of lakes, also a human health and well-being issue. So we can see the impacts of climate change really easily when we look in our backyard. This is data from Lake Mendota. Our ice records from Lake Mendota go back to about 1860. And so you guys can read along on that top caption up there. And so what you see here, so here, this little figure here with the bars and lines, this is the years where we had greater than 4 months of ice cover in Lake Mendota, 3 to 4 months, 1 to 2 months, and less than 1 month. And so prior to 1900s, 4 months of ice cover in Lake Mendota was relatively common. 19 of 45 years on record. The last time that happened was in 1977. We haven't seen 4 months of ice cover in 1977. Lake Mendota had less than 2 months of ice cover. An event never occurred before and has now been recorded in 1982, 5 times, with multiple freeze-thaw cycles. And you can look at this and see this transition. 2002, I believe, we had less than a month of ice cover. And so you can see this transition from lots of ice cover to little ice cover. So as I like to say, I do a fair amount with winter research, we're losing winter as we know it. And it's happening before our eyes. And it's not just Lake Mendota. This is part of that same bioscience article that I said that we looked at these long-term research programs. And so the top is from the Bonanza Creek. These are just different research programs that we're in. Ice is going out earlier on rivers. Hubbard Brook, this is out on the East Coast, Mirror Lake. You can see that ice out is happening earlier and earlier, and ice in, so when it's freezing, is happening later and later. These are on different scales, but looking down at Lake Mendota, you can look at the beginning to the end. You can visualize that loss of winter, that loss of ice cover that we end up seeing. And in fact, other colleagues of mine have gone and taken climate predictions and climate modeling and said, given a temperature increase, when, where, or where might we expect to see our lakes maybe not freeze? So intermittent ice cover. Up here, our lakes freeze every single year. How much of an increase in global temperature would we need to start seeing that our lakes might never freeze? And so we are, somewhere in that range, right in there, if I've got, yeah. And so somewhere in that 3+ degree increase in air temperatures. our lakes might not freeze in the winter anymore. We might not have winter like our grandparents and great-grandparents and everybody before us. It might look very different. And if you think down to Madison in southern Wisconsin, we've had years worth less than 1 month of ice cover. And so it's already happening at the southern parts of our, the extent of our state as that moves forward. And so we can expect, these numbers are well within reason of what we would expect global temperatures to increase. And so we can expect a day and age, it might not be in our lifetime, but we can expect a day and age if things progress the way they're going, that we might have years that our lakes are unfrozen or they don't freeze during the winter. And it's not just ice, it's also the water temperature, the water column. And so this is data from Lake Tahoe. And what you're looking here is the length of the stratified season. So does everybody here know when I said a lake is stratified what we mean? Got the warm water on top, cold water on the bottom. That happens during the spring, it sets up, you have stratified lake. And so what they can see, and so this starts in 1968 through about 2015, is the length of the stratification period is increasing. And then they went ahead and did some climate projection modeling of what climate might look like, took that back, fed it into physical models within the lake, and can continue to predict that that duration that our lakes are stratified, so that summer warm season is extending. This goes back to start of growing season, end of growing season. We're seeing increases in this warm period of our year in these areas where we have temperate climates and we have winter, and that's changing and having an impact on the lakes. And so there is a very distinct signal of climate within our physical dynamics of our lakes. And it's not just changes in ice cover, changes in water temperature. Up here particularly, it's also in the variability. And people probably here can experience that. Our springs have been really random and unpredictable. And so this is looking at the variability in ice out from Escanaba Lake, which is over by Trout Lake, Sparkling Lake, and then our longer record is Lake Mendota. And ice out, this isn't, pointer isn't working anymore. Ice out used to be a relatively predictable time period that happened. Sparkling Lake, the early part of the years, it was plus minus 8.8 days. So think about a biota living in this environment. Ice out happened predictably, and that's changing. And so if we look at the last 10 years, we've seen a doubling in that variance of ice out in our lakes. And so that variability in our ice out. So it not only is the mean changing, there's getting to be earlier and earlier, the variability in when it comes out is changing, and that's changing really fast right now. And so from the perspective of things that live in a lake, that variability we think actually might have more of an impact on those biota than the actual changes in the mean, which is happening relatively slowly. So how does this impact organisms? Third part of my talk. How does this impact the organisms and fish? And so, jokingly put this up as the average Wisconsin night question. How does this impact the walleye or the fish? So here's an example of walleye. This is data from Escanaba Lake. And they have an amazing record up in Escanaba on walleye. They've been studying that lake for a very, very long time. And what you see here in yellow is the walleye spawning date, and in blue is the ice out date in Escanaba Lake. Back at the early part of the records, walleye spawning and ice out was something that happened it happened together. Those were closely tied. Walleye typically we think spawn directly after ice out. But as climate has changed, spawning date has not kept up with the ice out date. And so there's a change in when they're happening, and they're no longer tightly coupled because walleye spawning hasn't adapted as fast as climate change is occurring. Does that make sense? And so if walleye were really adaptive, you might expect that they would just have the same trend line, that they would match it as they move through time, that they just go earlier and earlier. But as a species, they aren't adapting as fast and changing as fast as climate is changing at some point in time. And we think that this might have big implications. So looking at the data a little bit more closely, what are some of those implications that we might end up seeing? So here's the spawning date that I showed you before. And remember that ice off is changing even more rapidly than that. The variance in it looks very similar to that plot I showed you a couple slides ago. Remember we saw the big increases in variance? There's getting to be a lot more variability in when they're spawning. They're trying to, because they're cued to water temperature, and so they're keeping up to a certain extent, but there's a lot more variability. But what is that implication does that have? So over here on the left is the direct implication of that variability. And so here we have age 0, so these are our young of year, so these are the walleye that spawned, abundance. And here we have the days from the average spawning date. And so we're looking at when a population spawned in a given year, how far was it from the average, and what were the resulting number of walleye babies. Does that make sense? Closer to the average, we see there's a range in here, but we see the potential for really good year classes of walleye. We get a long ways from the average. There's not much happening up in that area of the graph. And so the farther away we get from that average spawning date, the less well we do in terms of walleye recruitment and walleye spawning. And so here's another example of just looking like, okay, fine, they spawned, they didn't make as many young walleye age 0 babies. Let's look at them the next year, age 1 fish. And so this is data out of Sparkling Lake. And what you can see is 2013 was a late year. And so that happened, the ice out happened really late. It was in May. 2012 was super early. And then 2011 was an average. And so this is the size of the walleye the following year. So these are age 1 walleye. So on an average year, we look at our average size. That's what they look like. Walleye, when ice went out early or late, those walleye are smaller. And it seems like the late has more of an impact than the early does in terms of the size distribution. And so not only do we not get as many young walleye happening, which is what we see here, but those walleye that make it through the first year are smaller. But not all fish respond the same way. And so walleye are an example, but I just want to throw this out here. This is yellow perch. You can see the average sits right in the middle. Late, they're a little bit smaller. Early, they're a little bit larger. And we think it has to do with their food resources and resource availability. So walleye are one that are really impacted by it. Perch is an example, don't seem to be impacted by it as much. So what do we think is going on? Why do we think in this example that we're talking about walleye, of what's going on in here? And we think it has to do with a mismatch in the timing of resources within the lakes that they're in. So I'll walk you through this and try and give you sort of an understanding of what we're looking at. So ice comes out here. Right after ice out, we get this nice bloom in algae, right? Ice went out, there's a whole bunch of light available in the lake that was blocked. We get this nice bloom in algae. We get a peak of rotifers, so these are the microzooplankton out there. And then the Daphnia are another zooplankton out there. Daphnia love algae, they're a grazer. And so right after you get a peak, often, how many people have heard of like a clear water period in a lake after the spring? That's a lot of times due to Daphnia grazing down that algae. So you get that big peak of algae, Daphnia come out, they eat all the algae, the perch spawn, or the perch come in. Perch, a lot of those young perch eat that algae as an early forage. Those perch get a little bit bigger, and then as those walleye are getting larger, the walleye then eat the baby perch. And so there's this logical sequence of things that need to happen in a specific order in order to get, going back to that walleye example, that optimal size walleye that we see in a normal year when our phenological cycle happens normally. What about in an early ice-off stage? We get this peak of algae normally. That's going to happen. That's a light-driven thing. We get the rotifers. Daphnia have other cues than just the presence of algae. So all of a sudden, you know, they come in, the perch spawn, the walleye spawn, but the Daphnia aren't there. And so the Daphnia aren't there at the time, and so the perch grow up later. And by the time the perch are larger, their gape size has been exceeded, and so the walleye can't eat them. And so there's been a mismatch in the timing of when that happens. And the same thing happens in late ice-off time periods. That comes, everything's muted. Things aren't happening in this historically progression that we end up seeing, this classic, what we call a phenological cycle. And so it's called a trophic mismatch is what's going on, is that there's a mismatch between the species that are present and what they need to eat on at a given point in time. And so we think that that's what's going on, and this is largely driven by this really rapid changes in ice-off that we're seeing. So this, back to that example of 2012 and 2013, I said the long-term average was 8 days. There was 54 days between those two. So think of an organism living in a lake that you're used to ice coming off within 8 days. All of a sudden, from 1 year to the next, there's a 54-day difference in when that ice came off of a lake. And you have to try to adapt to that. We think that that probably is going to have a larger impact on our aquatic ecosystems and the biota and the resilience of those ecosystems than the slow gradual change of the loss of lake ice and the loss of winter as we know it, is this really increased volatile nature that we're seeing in our environment right now. So how do we manage for this whiplash or climate change? One is we manage for diversity. We don't think about managing a system so that it's single species. The example, perch seem to be doing okay. Other species are doing okay. So we need to manage for diversity. Diversity equals resilience. And so the more diverse ecosystem we have, the more resilient they're going to be. We can't change here locally or at a lake scale the impact of actual it warming up, the loss of winter. But what we can do through our actions is work to maximize the diversity in the actions that we take within those ecosystems. We also need to maintain habitat complexity and connectivity. So here's an example of, this is from salmon abundance. And what you can see here is this is their prey production. And so you can see there's a change in aquatic and terrestrial prey production. But if you look at the salmon, it doesn't seem to have an impact. They have that connectivity between different resources. And so we can also think about this as connectivity between the landscape, connectivity between different water bodies. So they have the ability to change where their resources are coming from when they're eating, and as the result, them as a population are more resilient. So we could think about that within perspectives of climate change. How do we maintain that connectivity so that the biota, maybe they don't get what they wanted in the past, but there's another thing that they can draw on because our ecosystems are well connected, our shorelines are well preserved, we've got that terrestrial aquatic connectivity linkages there. The other one is understanding harvest implications. And so this is work by Steve Carpenter. And so basically you can think about, this is climate change on the x-axis, this is harvest on the y-axis. As climate change happens, we might have to think about changing our harvest perspectives, how many fish we take, so that our population, because if we start harvesting up into here, we're in an unsustainable fishery. And so we need to think about how we manage these systems to ensure that they might not be as resilient, so we might not be able to take as much anymore. And then the other is reduce other stressors that have to the ecosystem. And so before, finally to wrap up, I've given you some pictures about what climate change looks like in Wisconsin, what its physical implications we're having on the ecosystems, just a tidbit into how those cascade down into the biota that live in these ecosystems, and a little bit about what we can do, and just come back to, we just touched on a couple of these things in this conceptual figure. So it is a complicated issue. It is something that researchers are working on globally, that we're very interested in, and that I know you guys, as people who love lakes, work on lake associations, are really concerned about. and want to know how can we make our lakes and rivers as resilient as possible. And I think that connectivity, diversity, things like that, and thinking about managing for the climate that we might eventually live in instead of trying to necessarily hold on to the communities and things we have now because they might not be optimal for what we are in the future. So with that.
And next up, we have Tom Jarrow joining us from Wisconsin's Green Fire. I think he's going to explain a little bit about why we have Wisconsin's Green Fire, and it is sort of related to those budget reductions and things that we've been talking about with the DNR, but he's also going to delve into that complex topic of PFAS as well. So please give a Northwoods welcome to Tom Jarrow.
Thank you. So you see on the screen here our webpage, and on there you can see kind of our byline, which is Wisconsin's Green Fire supports conservation legacy by promoting science-based management of our natural resources. A novel idea. You might be thinking that I'm going to ask you for a donation, and I'm really not going to, at least not until you've supported Wisconsin Lakes, your local lake association, Oneida County Lakes and Rivers. Then, if you have something left in your piggy bank, and want to donate to Wisconsin Green Fire to support our mission, we would appreciate that very much. So today we're going to talk about PFAS in our surface water. We've heard a lot about it in our groundwater, and now we're going to talk about it in our surface water. And I've got three parts to my presentation. One is we're going to do a quick primer on PFAS and what it is and the impacts to the environment and human health. And the next thing we're going to talk about is where PFAS are in our surface water bodies. And you might be surprised to see where they are in our bodies. It's a really cool application on the DNR website. It's an interactive viewer, and we're going to be taking a look at that. And the last thing we're going to look at is fish advisories for our lakes and rivers that have PFAS in them and the implications those have to eating the fish that we catch. There's a novel idea in the Clean Water Act that our water should be clean, they should be fishable, they should be swimmable, and that's not always the case, even here in the Northwoods when we're looking at PFAS. All right, so we're going to be doing everything on the web, and so I don't have a PowerPoint, but anybody who wants a link to all the web pages I'm going to be presenting on, my email is on the back of our little publication that was at the front desk. So grab one of those, send me an email, I'll send you a link to all the web pages. So first of all, this is our issue paper on PFAS, our latest. We've had 2 issues, so this is the second version of it. And it is a lot about drinking water, but it's also a good primer on what PFAS are. And we're going to take a quick look at a couple of sections of this. And the first one here is where PFAS is found in the environment. And you can see them all there. I'm not going to read them all to you, but there's some other ones that are missing on this little chart here, or diagram. One is they're in firefighting foam. And a lot of the sites in Wisconsin, like the one in the city of Rhinelander, are related to firefighting foam. They're also in cosmetics. People don't often realize this. Lipstick, sunscreen, lotion. Now, dermally, PFAS are not so much an issue. But I've read some interesting things about suntan lotion. So when you go swimming and you buy the suntan lotion that you don't have to reapply after going swimming, that's because it has PFAS in it. It repels water. And so that's on your skin for a longer period of time, and it can be absorbed into your skin. Showering is not usually a problem, though. According to the expert at the Department of Health, that's not my bailiwick, it's a Department of Health issue. So that's just a little bit about where we find PFAS. Next, we're going to take a little bit of a view at some of the PFAS PFOA and PFOS are the most toxic that we know of. There are over 10,000 versions of polyfluorinated chemicals. So their carbon-fluorine bond is very, very strong. And that's one of the reasons they're so useful to us in our society, is because it doesn't degrade, but it's also one of the problems in the environment. And these are the two of the worst. They've been discontinued in use, but we still have legacy contamination to deal with that have, since they've been used since the 1950s, we still have that legacy contamination to deal with. So when the industry eliminated those, they went to shorter chain PFAS chemicals, and this is a list of the shorter chain PFAS chemicals, thinking that they would be less toxic. Well, it turns out they are still toxic, just not at the low levels that PFOA and PFOS is. So they're still toxic, and I think the moral of that story is that we need to get PFAS out of our supply chain. So I want everybody to look at their shoes for a minute. Anybody have Keen outdoor shoes on? All right, PFAS free. You as consumers can drive this issue. We did that for BPA. That was in baby bottles, if you remember that, and it was toxic. So Keen shoes are one of the only shoe manufacturers, outdoor shoe manufacturers, that are still water resistant but don't use PFAS. This is a complicated graphic, much like Noah had. So PFAS in the environment is just, there's no getting rid of it. You can't destroy it. The carbon-fluorine bond is very strong, and there's no known way to destroy it. So we just kind of move it around all the time. So you have here the industry that might be coating their paper. That water goes to a wastewater treatment plant. It's treated, and then typically for most paper mills and municipalities, they land apply the PFAS or the sludge, or what they call biosolids, to farmland. It has lots of good nutrients to grow crops, but it also has this contamination. And so from there, some of the groundwater is contaminated because PFAS doesn't bind to soil like a lot of other contaminants do as much. Does a little bit, but mostly they call it in the hydrogeological community a screamer. So it goes right to the groundwater or surface water. And so you can see it's just one big cycle. It's pretty complex. Modern landfills are lined and don't typically leak PFAS, but then they collect the leachate that goes back to the wastewater treatment plant. And what the wastewater treatment plant does is it concentrates it, because, and we're going to talk about this next, maybe we'll just go there. So we're going to talk about the human health impacts. They bind to proteins. So a lot of our traditional chemicals bind to the fat in your body, but PFAS binds to the proteins. And I'm just going to read this section because I don't want to mess it up, and I think it's important you have the important information. So they particularly in the liver and blood, they bind there. Current research suggests that high levels of PFAS increase cholesterol levels, interfere with natural hormone levels, decrease how well the body reacts to vaccines, changes liver enzymes, increases the risk of certain cancers, and increases the risk of pregnancy complication such as preeclampsia and lower birth weight in newborns. And let's just take a look at cancer alone here. Kidney cancer, thyroid disease, and then testicular cancer. Over in Marinette, there's teenage boys that have testicular cancer. It's tragic. It really is a very toxic material, particularly PFOA and PFOS, and we've got to pay attention to what it is doing to our surface waters. So we'll come back probably to this diagram a little later, or talk about it at least. So we were able to pass standards for PFAS, and I don't expect you to be able to read this, for surface water bodies. And so this is what a wastewater treatment plant can legally discharge to surface water bodies. 8 nanograms per liter, which is parts per trillion for PFOA, and for PFOS, there's 2 standards. There's one for if it's used as a drinking water supply, which would be 20 nanograms per liter, and then if it's not used for a drinking water supply, it's 95. And for some reason, when we get to the fish advisories, the PFOS is what's used to issue the fish advisories. All right, so this is the interactive viewer that I was going to talk about, and I'm going to try to play this video from the beginning. Though it looks like I stopped it part way.
The DNR is proud to lead
Oh.
in addressing PFAS contamination in Wisconsin.
Not getting the volume. All right, so we're going to do this. We're going to skip the video. That's all right. Don't worry about it. I can show you how to do this on the next slide here. All right, so really it's just showing you this viewer that's available on the DNR website. And again, if you email me, I'll send you a link to it. Or you can just simply enter into the search engine and the DNR PFAS page, interactive viewer, and it'll come up. So this might look like there's PFAS everywhere in the state. The only thing I'm going to say is all the green dots are most likely either not detected, or it's been sampled but not detected, or it's below the health standard. And we're going to come back to the standards here in a little bit, but at least the health standard recommended by the Wisconsin Department of Health. So that's the other thing. Over here is the legend on this side. And so these square dots, and you see one right here in Rhinelander, says there's 3 sites in Rhinelander where PFAS are a problem. So those 3 sites in the Rhinelander area, those 3 sites are the city wells, which again were mostly impacted by firefighting foam. Perhaps some biosolids might have impacted the wells at the city well. Then the old landfill, which is not lined, and it's sitting in the groundwater, has had some detections of PFAS, not terribly high, but they're there, and it sits right in the Pelican River watershed, right adjacent to it. So, and this is an old landfill from the 1950s. And then we're going to spend some significant time today talking about the contamination in the town of Stella, or Starks, where PFAS was found. So there's that, and then there's a legend down here that talks about all of what the symbols mean. The triangles are surface water samples. The round circles are groundwater samples. The squares are contamination sites. One thing you can do if you want to just look at one particular issue is you can unclick some of these buttons up here and just look at the sites where they found PFAS and where they're currently investigating PFAS. So it's a neat little tool. I encourage you to look at it. You can pan around on it. You can zero in on different parts of it, and we'll be doing that. And you can see up here, this is the Stark Stella area, and we're going to be talking about that in some detail. But it's a really neat tool. These orange-brown sites are where we have fish advisories, and we'll be talking some more about that. All right, so this is the town of Stella. This is a beautiful Moen Lake chain. Anybody here from the Moen Lake chain? I know there's a couple. So it's a beautiful chain in the Starks area, and you can see those pink triangles are surface water samples. So if you go ahead, I might just blow this up a little bit more. If you go ahead and click on these, you can bring up the data for it, and you can actually see the actual amounts, and you can see there that it's, I think, 429 parts per trillion, PFOA, and 17. Those are really high. They're our highest in the state of Wisconsin. I saw a news report that they said they were the highest in the nation. I have no way to verify that veracity of that statement, but I do know that they're the highest concentrations that exist in the state of Wisconsin. So then I wanted to take a look at, in addition to the Moen Lake chain, I wanted to take a look at, this is Snowden Lake right here. And so let's take a look at this particular sample site. I'm cooperating here. There we go. All right, so there you can see the concentration is 1,620 parts per million, parts per trillion, or nanograms per liter in the water in Snowden Lake. Again, one of the highest in the state of Wisconsin. We'll talk a little bit about that a little later. One thing I wanted to point out here is that in order to sample this, they had to dilute the sample, it was so high, which then changes it's actually an estimated amount because the whole process of analyzing it is corrupted by the process of having to dilute it. So it's an estimated value, but it's nevertheless very, very high. So I wanted to go over here and take a look at, let me zoom out a little bit. So I wanted to take a look at the town of Celis site here in a little bit more detail. And the one thing that stood out to me here is it lists the source of the contamination as unknown. So you Moen Lake people, do you know the source of the contamination?
Probably sludge.
So the most likely source is biosolids, both from the paper mill and from the municipal water supply, both which would have had, particularly in that time period in the 90s and 80s, would have probably had high concentrations of PFAS in their biosolids because of how we were using the material in the community.
But were they using the sludge from the paper manufacturing facility as fertilizer?
It is nutrient rich and it does grow really good crops. So let's hold the questions to Leanne, right, Eric? But the one thing I would say, the current mill operated by Ulster-Munsko is a European company. As soon as they bought the mill, they stopped using PFAS because they knew the implications of it. And so we are really dealing with the legacy contamination from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and sometime in the 90s they used to landfill paper mill sludge, but then they started applying it to land because it had good crop growing capabilities. And you can see on the air photo here all the potato fields out there, and they would have reapplied it every year because it had that nutrient capability to support crops. All right, so I wanted to take, this is groundwater data, and of course the red are all above the Wisconsin health standard. And you're going to say, wait a minute, Tom, I thought you were going to talk about PFAS in the surface water. Well, the title of your conference has interconnected in it. And it doesn't take a research science like NOAA to look at all these red surface or groundwater samples right adjacent to Snowden Lake to tell you that the contamination is moving from the groundwater into the surface water body and contaminating. The other thing, if we go back to the previous slide, I just want to point out the orange is fish advisories. And I noticed right away, even though Snowden Lake has the highest concentration of PFAS in the state, it doesn't have a fish advisory. So I called the DNR fisheries people, and they're currently waiting on analysis of the data. This is really a complicated process, and they have to look at a lot of information and data before they issue a fish advisory. But my advice, if you live on Snowden Lake, is you shouldn't be eating the fish at all. But we'll see what the DNR comes out with, and then probably, they said about 4 or 5 more months and they'd complete the process. Get back. So I wanted to swim a little bit off here. All right, so there again, you can see that it's moving from the groundwater to the surface water. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the fish advisories. And I wanted to first, before we look at that, right now you can see some of it, but if you turn these links off, you can see where we have fish advisories. The one thing that seemed to me that stuck out when I look at the statewide map is there really isn't that many spots where PFAS are a problem in terms of the fish advisories. The only thing is, when they discovered that there were PFAS in the Stark-Stella area, it was from a random sampling of 450 drinking water supplies. And they stumbled on this accidentally. And I just wonder how many other Moen Lake chains are out there where they don't know yet because it hasn't been sampled. That's what some of that $125 million could be used for, is doing a complete assessment of our surface water bodies to know where PFAS is. Also looking at inventorying all the places where the various biosolids were spread. So it really needs to get unleashed at some point, and hopefully we'll get there. So we are going to take a little deeper dive into, again, the fish advisories in Stella, or the Moen Lake chain. And if I get lost here on the panning, better zoom back out. All right, so it's right here, and I'm just going to go. If you click on this, you have to go a couple of clicks in, and you will eventually get, and again, I'll send you this all in an email if you're interested, and you get to the fish advisory for the Moen Lake change. So for a lot of things, it's once a week for PCBs and dioxins. Even in the Great Lakes, it's once a week, but on the Moen Lake chain, it's all fish, all sizes, and it's 1 meal a month. So again, given the human health implications, I suggest you follow the fish advisories when consuming fish. Now, I was talking to the fisheries biologist, I already mentioned that. You know, we run into different kinds of people. There's people that just won't eat any fish, and because they're concerned about the contamination. And you know, fish is a healthy food. There's no reason not to eat it. And then there's the other extreme, the people that totally don't pay attention to the fish advisory and eat it anyway. And so far, we're trying to encourage people to follow the advisory. We have toxicologists and health experts that look at this, and it's really important to follow the advisories. So let's take another look at another one. So this is again, this is the Hat Rapids flowage. I live on the Hat Rapids flowage, so it's important to me. And the one thing I wanted to notice here is look at the species. Typically, they're telling us don't eat the big walleye because it's got mercury and PCBs in it. Now they're telling us not to eat the perch that are going to be doing better under climate change. So it just has to do with the fact that perch eat a lot of zooplankton, and PFAS has an affinity for the zooplankton, and so they are more susceptible to higher concentrations. It does bioaccumulate, but at least in this particular case on the Hat Rapids flowage, these were the fish that had the higher concentrations. And then last, we're going to take a look at Lake Superior, which I found really interesting. 1 meal a month, again, that's pretty extreme, of smelt. Again, not the big fish. All the green on here is for, if you look at the chart here, is for PCBs and mercuries in the Great Lakes. And it's when they sampled it, it was the smelt that were impacted. So I think we're back on time. I could take a few questions.
You have time for some questions. I see you want to hand up right in the front.
Kelly from Pelican Lake. Not trying to be a guy as following person, but from you saying no money's being released to do the studies, the DNR has manpower now. Would it behoove individual lake associations? And you're saying that one lake that had all the triangles in it had no fish advisory, that maybe as associations we should do PFAS testing on our lakes and not wait for DNR.
You certainly can. It is expensive. $300, $400, $500 per sample. We're fortunate in the Northwoods to have, you can send it to the State Lab of Hygiene, but we're also fortunate to have Northern Lake Services, which is right in Crandon. They can do a sample there. They'll help you with the process, et cetera.
Tom, can you comment on how it's not the same as taking like a phosphorus sample, that you're going to not generally want to be a citizen volunteer taking the sample?
It is, and Northern Lake Service will help you with the protocol, because you have to be really, really careful, because we're measuring it at such a low concentration. It is difficult to do, and in some cases you might be better off with working with somebody who knows what they're doing.
Other questions? Got one in the back here, and then we'll go in the back over there.
Question, paper mill sludge appears to be the indicator of what happened out in the mowing. Other areas where paper mill sludge was used, we have a lot of potato field areas. I'm from that Schreer Camp area. Do we know other areas where that might have been deposited? And one last question, how about the human sludge from waste that is spread all over the place too, close to our bodies of water?
So again, we're dealing with stuff that was done in the 80s and 90s. So a lot of it is paper records about where it was applied. And so when you start looking at this, it's a monumental task to get at it. But certainly since we know it's a problem in Sark Stella, you know, we could be looking into what Wassa Papers did or what Domtar did, because the mill has changed hands over the years, and that's another complicating factor. But part of the problem is we're dealing with paper records.
And that question in the back.
Yeah, the recent study showed nationwide actually in bodies of fish, the meat was tested for PFAS. And after that study, a number of toxicologists and health people came out and were obviously lobbying for a much, much lower parts per trillion threshold. The threshold that exists today is absolutely an unhealthy threshold, and yet the fish advisories are still utilizing that threshold.
Yeah. So it's not just the fish advisories, it's the drinking water standards. And I was supposed to talk about this, so I want to thank you for bringing it up. So we in Wisconsin adopted 70 parts per trillion in our drinking water. We ignored the Department of Health recommendation of 20 parts per million, and it was a political decision made by the Natural Resources Board, and it was partly by lobbying on industry, that we adopted a higher standard than we should have. And now recently EPA lowered the standard to 4 parts per trillion for drinking water, which is that's really the detection limit. And that is because once it enters your body, it does not leave your body. And so that's why it's so low, because it can build up your body and cause all these health problems. And so there again, we're going to have to go back through our regulations and lower the concentrations from 70, which is a process. In the meantime, the drinking water standards do apply to those of us who drink municipal water. They don't apply to people who drink out of a water supply well, like many of you people. I'd still recommend it, since it's based on health, that you follow the 4 parts per trillion.
Thank you. And I do need to cut this so that we can get to our break, but I do want to appreciate the time. All right, I think we're ready to introduce our panel. So we'll get back to this. We've got a list of the people who are on the panel. I think we'll go through this. What we're going to have each panelist do is introduce themselves. We've got microphones up here so they can pass them around amongst themselves. They're going to tell us who they are, kind of how they got into water resources and this type of work, and maybe talk about everybody here is representing sort of a different organization. So maybe briefly touch on kind of what your organization is up to and what they do, and then we're going to start kind of interacting with each other and kind of playing off of some of the morning presentations, and then eventually we'll get into audience questions. So Ben, you're up first. Tell us a bit about Wisconsin Valley Improvement Company.
Thanks, Eric. My name is Ben Niffenegger. I'm the Executive Officer of Strategy and Regulatory for Wisconsin Valley Improvement Company. I was a UW-Stevens Point graduate in land use planning, natural resource management, and so that was kind of all-encompassing air, water, land, wildlife, and really kind of bodes well for what I do now. I actually got my start at a few of these types of conferences as a shoreline protection specialist with Lincoln and Langlade counties, and I was on a DNR grant-funded grant, and for a few years, and then I joined Wisconsin Valley Improvement Company in 2011. And Wisconsin Valley Improvement Company is rather unique in that we were publicly chartered by the state of Wisconsin back in 1907, but we've always been privately owned and funded. And our public charter is pretty straightforward. It's to basically provide as uniform a flow as practicable in the Wisconsin and Tomahawk rivers. And we do that by storing surplus water in reservoirs and then discharging that water when the natural flow in the Wisconsin or Tomahawk rivers is low. And we do that by managing 21 storage reservoirs, really in Gogebic, Vilas, Lincoln, Oneida, and Marathon counties. Of those 21 storage reservoirs, about 60 named lakes kind of comprise those. And so we're unique in that we're a private entity that manages a public water resource. And so we're regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which tries to balance out some of those private and public interests. So our company doesn't make any money off of the water. We basically break even every year. We don't have any hydropower production. We're strictly in the business of storing water. But we do pass that water on downstream for the hydro plant owners, which is a mixture of public utilities, where some of us get our electricity from, as well as paper mills, and they actually help to fund the operations. But there's the other side, is the public component side, and that's where we have robust management plans as part of our federal license, and working with federal and state cooperators like the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, the U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, all of the tribes in the state, and as well as the public, so lake districts, lake associations. We have a really robust kind of public involvement plan that's kind of outlined in that federal license to interact and continually adapt our management plans and what we focus on, every few years. And so I can talk a little bit more about kind of what we do. We've got our hands in a lot of different aspects of natural resource management, but for now I will pass on to another panelist.
All right, thank you, Ben. Next on the list we have Jim. Jim Ruwalt is joining us from Wisconsin Wetlands.
I'm Jim Ruwalt. I'm on the board of directors of the Wisconsin Wetlands Association. I am retired from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where I was the private lands coordinator for Wisconsin for 15 years and restored wetlands primarily all across the state. Also, we worked in restoring endangered species habitat. But the Wisconsin Wetlands Association, where I'm involved now, is a private member-driven organization located in Madison with the mission of restoring, protecting wetlands across the state for the enjoyment of the people of the state of Wisconsin. We work directly with landowners. Fairly large project going on right now on the Little Plover River with the irrigators there. We also work with policymakers, the state legislature, primarily in developing plans to streamline wetland restoration regulations and measures for wetland protection.
Great. Thank you, Jim. And then next on the list, we'll pass it back to the right to Joanne Lund.
Thank you. My name's Joanne Lund. I work for Oneida County Land and Water Conservation as a special projects coordinator. The first 3 years I worked on roadway stream crossing inventory, which involved locating all the river crossings that are on public roads, and so we assessed the condition of those across the county. It was 308 total. They were uploaded to the Great Lakes Stream Crossing Inventory database, which is open. It's available to the public, so anybody can, it's the easiest way is to look at the maps and then find a crossing of interest, and you just click on it and you get all the information. So it's really great having that centralized and available. And the last year and a half or so, I've been working on a high quality waters protection project, which involves promotion of our wonderful high quality watersheds we have in Oneida County and really all across northern Wisconsin. And we're also working on a lakes classification system with protection activities to keep those healthy lakes healthy. And I neglected to mention that part of the stream crossing inventory was freshwater mussel monitoring. So there's we have an exhibit and a nice banner out available in the open area. So I'm going to pass it on then to next.
Okay, thank you, Joanne.
Norm.
Next on the list is Norm McKinnells with the Spider Lake Association of Iron County.
Thank you. My name is Norm McKinnells. I am the president of the Spider Lake Association of Iron County, as there are at least 4 other Spider Lakes in Wisconsin, so we have to identify where we come from. And I've been on the board for 11 years, 6 years as a vice president, and now the last 5 as president. We are located on the Turtle River chain of lakes, which is again in Iron County. And as part of that chain, the chain actually starts in its watershed form in the UP on some small lakes up in that area, and then flowing downstream all the way to the Turtle Flammable Flowage. Along the way, there's lakes that have had issues with invasives and others that did not. But so a few years ago, we ventured into an opportunity that came across our desk in applying for a water surface grant to put together a lake management plan. And the reason for it was to try to preserve all of the natural resources that we have in place on our lake and to find out if we had any issues. So we hired a company that did a very, very intensive study of the lake, including taking core samples from the deepest part of the lake, which is about 50 feet deep. And after the study was put together, we found that our lake was in real good shape. We do have a small outbreak of purple loosestripe, a shoreline invasive. But other than that, they identified our lake as very good and really like pristine. So we then sat down and put together action steps or goals that would preserve this pristine body of water that we have and try to protect everything that's in place so it can stay the way it is. So as part of that, it inspired us to think outside of the box, if you are outside of the boundaries of our lake, and look at the chain of lakes, because we realize that unlike a trip to Vegas, what happens in our lake doesn't necessarily stay in our lake. So we're always concerned about our lake developing something that would go downstream, or another lake upstream developing something, or having some invasive come in that would come downstream through us. So the chain includes 20 water, at least 20 water bodies and lakes that are either watershed lakes that put water into the chain, the Turtle River, or they're lakes that actually have water that flows in and flows out. And those are true links of the chain. Downstream from us, about 3 lakes down, there's a lake that has curly leaf pondweed, and that curly leaf pondweed is now transferred from them to the Turtle River, downstream from them, and then into another lake, and it looks like it could possibly end up in the Turtle Flammable Flowage, which is a huge body of water and currently has an outbreak of Eurasian water milfoil. Upstream from our lake, we're kind of in the middle of the whole chain. Most of those lakes aren't concerned with removing or managing an invasive. They're more concerned with stocking walleye in their lake, which is a good problem, but it's quite different from those that are downstream. So what we are trying to do as an association is to collaborate and create awareness to all of the lakes on the chain, so that we can work together and share ideas, share thoughts, and hopefully help each other when we have a problem or something breaks out. So I'll pass it on.
All right, thank you, Norm. And then finally, Johnson Bridgewater with the River Alliance.
Awesome, really glad to be here. My first visit to this meeting, so thank you all. I live just up the way near Hurley, so I'm full-time up north. So I'm the Water Advocates Organizer for River Alliance of Wisconsin. We just celebrated our 30th anniversary, and to try and kind of summarize, because we cover a lot of ground, we are a statewide organization that focuses on empowering people to protect and restore water. Well, that can mean a number of things to a number of different people, but the way I would put it is we typically work at the grass tops level, meaning we work with helping and advising other nonprofits all over Wisconsin, but we also work specifically on certain issues. The organization was founded and started out working on dam removals. That continues to be part of our work and has been for the past 30 years. We're one of the few nonprofits that actually engaged in the regulatory process, which can be, and I actually know that they worked with you at one point a little bit. So, but we also work on large scale issues. We have 2 big programs that we're developing that I'm excited about. One is called the Wisconsin Agricultural Agenda, and one is called the Wisconsin Water Agenda. They are actually putting together real world attempts to rethink how water should be managed. So taking water and managing at the watershed scale, what would that mean for management in terms of how it's happening now? And I can tell you there are a lot of changes that would be necessary. So we're basically working towards the future. Myself, as a Water Advocates Organizer, my 2 main focus areas are pushing back on metallic sulfide mining. And if you haven't been following that in Wisconsin, you should be, because the federal government is pushing a huge mining agenda, and they're funding it on both sides of us, and Wisconsin is in between and part of a big mining belt that is absolutely of interest to a lot of people. What I'm really excited about, though, and just a quick thing that I would say, when you think about advocacy, I think people often think about advocating for their organization. We're getting ready to launch a new program on advocating for manoomin, or wild rice. And I would just encourage all of you, because a lot of you live in spaces where wild rice occurs, and that's just my pitch. If you're not familiar with it, get familiar with it, study it, know what it is, and know that yes, it is actually regulated and managed. So I'll just end with that.
All right. Well, you got a sense of the breadth of people up here. There's not a lot of things that actually string these people together, except for maybe water. Water is kind of what brought us here, but we are all connected. And I figured I would take sort of a watershed approach to this. We don't have a precipitation person here, but the wetlands end up being one of the first places where water starts to gather on the landscape. Wisconsin has lost a significant share of its naturally occurring wetlands, but in northern Wisconsin, we're actually quite fortunate, I think, to have a lot of our intact wetlands. Jim, do you want to touch on, or can you describe some of the work that Wisconsin Wetlands is doing, potentially like some of the stuff in the Marengo River watershed or in other watersheds, trying to advocate for both recognizing the wetlands' power to deal with hydrology, as well as restoring that power?
We focus on hydrological restoration of wetlands, meaning that we try to look at the wetlands on the landscape, or what used to be on the landscape, and how they fit into all the different hydrological aspects of wetlands, similar to what they're doing on the Spider Lake chain, I would say. And we do that both on the ground with our partners. We partner with many different organizations, state-level organizations, federal organizations, private groups like Ducks Unlimited, Wisconsin Waterfowl Association, and others. The Bad River Tribe, and so on, and using their resources, which they have resources for the actual on-the-ground restoration. We do provide some funding for that kind of work, but we're primarily an advocacy group that works with our partners in developing projects that can result in good hydrological restoration of wetlands. The other part, second part of what we really do is our protection goals, which are to work, as I mentioned, with policymakers to develop good policy for protecting wetlands that we do have and protecting wetlands that we have restored. And so it's really a two-part process where restoring wetlands is important, but you got to protect what we have already. And so that's what our real objective is. And then, as I said, also for the enjoyment of the people of the state of Wisconsin. And we try to encourage use of wetlands. We try to encourage the appreciation of wetlands and what they do and how important they are into the landscape.
And you mentioned the policy angle, and there was a recent policy accomplishment, right, from Wisconsin Wetlands in terms of getting something through the legislature and signed into law related to this hydrological restoration?
Right, and related to the permitting aspects of it and simplifying the permitting, and which if you're going to destroy a wetland, you have to have permits to do it. And if you're going to restore a wetland, you have to have permits to do it. So we are working on the side of trying to simplify the permitting aspect of the restoration work.
Now, typically, if you're driving around northern Wisconsin or anywhere and you've come across a wetland, it seems like there's one of two things. It could either be a complete bowl that drains only back into groundwater. It's the source of groundwater feeding into an area. Or oftentimes you'll find that wetland sort of the water's moving in a certain way. It's headed somewhere, and somewhere is usually a culvert. It's gonna run into a street or a road, a driveway, something, and that's where you're gonna really be able to catch up with seeing how that water is moving. Can you talk a bit about the culvert work in specific, and is my description accurate? Did you find a lot of culverts that sort of on one side of the culvert there's a wetland, and on the other side now it's more of a headwater stream?
Yeah, all varieties. I mean, there's culverts with wetlands on both sides. There's just a moving stream. I mean, because there are a lot of culverts. But I might say that out of this is kind of different, you didn't ask this, but out of the, looking at all the culverts, 75% were undersized and 75% did not meet buried depth standards, so they weren't set low enough to keep the water flowing. And there were only 16% that were not deemed a barrier to fish and other aquatic life passage. So, I think in the past people have tried to minimize the size to minimize the cost. And of course there are other costs that aren't monetary.
Right.
Yeah.
And then that's what I was going to ask. We aren't inventorying culverts just so that we have a list or an inventory. The idea is to translate this into possibly an action plan to let you prioritize. Like you mentioned, some are undersized, but even some are probably more undersized than others.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And part of what we see in the landscape too is when we have a heavy storm event, if it is just a culvert that's supposed to be managing the water, it's not really designed to be a dynamic water management system, right?
Right, yes, that's true.
Have you had, during your course of fieldwork, did you experience any blowouts or places where the culverts were clearly failed?
Yes, every year there have been failures, a handful in the county. They really all need redoing, but of course that's expensive. I might add that the town of Newbold is developing a culvert action plan now. So we're just kind of getting those wheels turning to stay ahead of blowouts. And to be able to plan funding for replacements. So that's something that we would hope a lot of other organizations would look at as well.
And then one thing that Noah Lattig didn't mention really in the climate change presentation, that was focused heavily on temperatures, which is part of it, but we are seeing these changing storm dynamics. We're seeing the potential for heavier rains, and you don't have to look very far in history to find, both in Minnesota and Wisconsin, occasions where an antiquated dam wasn't up to the debris flow that came with a heavy storm event, and it wasn't designed to have the overflow capacity. And so in Manawa in Wisconsin, and I think it was on the Blue Earth River in Minnesota, the dam completely failed. That kind of leads to Johnson then, thinking about these dam removals. When you say we have, you're focusing on dam, or there is a focus on dam removals, how do they prioritize? I imagine you're not going after the Wisconsin Valley Improvement Corporation system of dams, which are very large and probably well-managed dams. What is the dam situation in Wisconsin?
Yeah, so we actually have We actually have somebody on our staff, Ellen Voss, who is charged with climate resiliency and dams. If she were here, she could answer better. But what I will tell you, the number one issue is cost. We are regularly contacted by people who are interested in the issue. It comes down to how much it's going to cost to work on this. The other thing that's interesting is it is often divisive in a community. Almost every time you have people who are, I grew up with that mill pond and it's been there, as long as I can remember, versus people who are looking longer term and are looking at dams blowing out, are looking at the fact that nature tends to be able to handle water better. So we're in this interesting stage where it's becoming, it kind of comes and goes in waves. But dams are back on topic again. And one of the unique things is Wisconsin is home to, and I forgot the name of it, but there are a ton of these, what they're called low water dams spread all across the agricultural areas. We're getting ready, and they are often in a state of failure or not serving their purpose anyway, but we're getting ready to have a crisis. There are hundreds of these dams that have to be dealt with. And I don't know if I specifically answered your question other than to say, River Alliance ourselves, we engage where we are invited. So that's one of the beauties is typically we're invited into a dam situation. But again, from that point forward, that tends to be hot and divisive. And I don't know if you have any specific questions about it, but I can just tell you that dams are an emotional issue for a lot of people in Wisconsin.
Sure. And I think I'm thinking about the fact that there are so many, you mentioned the smaller ones, and then there's the next size up. There's still hundreds and hundreds of still relatively small. They don't really produce any hydropower. They're historically, now they're just there kind of to maintain the mill pond. But those dams aren't getting any younger over time.
Absolutely.
And their design might have not been that great to begin with. The two blowouts most recently was because they were just sort of a top overflow design that didn't really take into account what happens when a bunch of trees come downstream and start clogging up that system.
It really points, I think everybody today, I've been really impressed with how well this has been discussed. Climate change, and as Noah mentioned, it's the variability, right? We are now having these extreme spikes and jumping all around. We're not built for the variability, and I'll just say that. I think that is why they're becoming, yes, they're aging out, but on top of that, hydrology is changing annually, I'll just put it that way, in a number of ways, and it becomes harder if you're relying on maintaining everything uniformly when the uniformity has disappeared. all of these infrastructure issues become much more difficult to manage.
So my next step down the watershed, I'm going to get to the bigger flowages, I guess. We've gone through the culverts, we've gone through some little streams and maybe over some little dams. Hopefully some of them maybe get removed if they no longer serve their purpose. But then we have these really large dams. And Ben, can you reflect on what was just mentioned about the variability? It sounds like if this entity has existed since the early 1900s, I assume you have records.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a great discussion because really it just emphasizes everything is interconnected. So I could pretty much touch on everything that has been discussed so far. But yeah, our records go back to the 1890s that we have, and we've got some fantastic graphs just showing those continual changes. And what we saw kind of in the last 2 decades is we had our worst extended drought in history from about 2002 to 2012, and then directly following that was the wettest recorded period in our history. And so we talk about that in every presentation, that really even just in my tenure, 2011, when I started, we were at the tail end of a ridiculous drought where there was areas of Vilas County that were 50 inches deficit in precip over that time period. And of course, the management issues and concerns that people had at that time were much different than the concerns they've had the last 2 or 3 years, where now we're at the tail end of the wettest period. And so it gets to the higher intensity storm events, localized precipitation. As good as forecasting is, we work really closely with the National Weather Service and the River Forecast Center out of Chanhassen, Minnesota. We get the latest modeling, the best available information. You will notice in every weather report, it will always have a little line that says, locally higher amounts, right? You just cannot model to a localized small watershed level, and that's where we have to build systems that are resilient. Adaptability is a key word, having adaptive management plans. And really, it all gets tied in on the micro level and the macro level. So you have every one of those wetlands that was either removed or altered. You have every culvert that was either undersized, oversized, placed incorrectly at the wrong elevation. All of that has a cumulative impact as it works its way from the smaller watersheds, the smaller tributaries, to the larger tributaries and the larger watersheds and larger water bodies. And so we have taken a pretty aggressive approach towards contacting the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, the DNR, the counties, the towns, people involved with hydrologic structures that aren't dams, things like culverts, and making sure when you're doing a replacement project, contact WVIC, because if it's within our watershed, what you do is going to have an impact on how we receive water and how we're able to discharge or get rid of water. And so we're always a proponent of the more free-flowing, open structures you can get to allow that natural flow both upstream and downstream certainly makes our job a lot easier. And so, yeah, wetlands and culverts are certainly tied in. And then in terms of dam removal too, some of you may be thinking, oh, this might be an uncomfortable conversation. We've got River Alliance talking about dam removal. We got WVIC in the dam business. It's not uncomfortable. We've been partners for years and decades. Not all dams are created equal. Unfortunately, I think we can say there's too many choices that come down to binary, good, bad, yes, no, black, white. That's not how the real world works. There are beneficial dams. There's dams that have seen the better days that can go. And so everything's on a spectrum, I guess, as we talk about all these issues.
And Ben, before I leave you and transition back to Norm, I want to talk a bit about those big reservoirs and how there could be potentially a conflict. I want you to help me work out this one. You're managing, as you said, to have a regular flow pretty much down the main stem to the larger dams and the power generating dams down below. But that also means that there can be some extremes in terms of the reservoirs, what they look like, both in terms of high, but particularly on the low end. Talk a bit about the ecological responsibility around those reservoirs and how is that managed, and then relate that maybe to invasive species. What sort of interesting invasive challenges come about as you're raising and lowering the reservoirs?
Yeah, so those are great points. One of the things that WVIC did that was kind of unique compared to some other dam owners is we really started collecting data back in the 1970s and the 1980s. When the Clean Water Clean Water Act was passed, we could kind of foresee, obviously, managing water for multiple interests is going to be a priority. And so we collected a lot of in-house data, really even before some state agencies were collecting data. And where we've kind of come to now is, rather than us as an entity deciding what are going to be the winners and losers when it comes to water scarcity or water supplementation, Obviously if you have a finite amount of water, it either has to come from somewhere and it has to go somewhere. And so where are those priorities? Is it downstream rivers? Is it in reservoir priorities? And so what we've done is we've developed our management plans to be adaptive. And so in the case of drought, we have a drought contingency plan where we don't list every potential scenario because we'll never get them all. Just this last year is a great example where we had never forecasted not having snow all winter and being in a drought in the month of March. There was no precedent for that. There was no history. There was nothing from us to draw on our 100 years of experience to look at. How should we handle this? Where people are reaching out to us, even agencies asking, what are you doing? And we said, well, we're not really sure. We're going to be honest. And so rather than us as a private entity making some of those large resource decisions, what we do is we consult with the resource agencies that are charged with making decisions in the public's best interest. And so when we run into these difficult situations, that's where we reach out to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Wisconsin DNR, the Michigan DNR, the Forest Service, those entities to kind of use some of that collective wisdom. And ultimately the balancing of priorities and the winners and losers gets decided as a public agency feedback to WVIC. And then we coordinate with the federal government too. So it's a collective decision-making process to address those. But with that comes, as you can imagine, a whole lot of bureaucracy, red tapes. Believe it or not, within WVIC's organization, we don't necessarily agree on everything. Within the Wisconsin DNR, different departments don't necessarily agree on everything. Within the county, it's across the board. You have different viewpoints. And so that can be both good and bad because you get to see those different viewpoints, but it becomes very hard to make quick decisions. And sometimes you need to make quick decisions. And so this is a long walk that I'm getting to answer your final question related to invasive species, even walleye management, is through regulation, WVIC has done a fantastic job over the years of regulating water levels to what was desired by the agencies and what was desired by the lake associations. We've been doing that for 100 years through a variety of scenarios, and we've done that. In my opinion, I think we have done that too well. We have managed our water bodies at too much of a consistent level. And so getting back to an ecological perspective, there's starting to be a bit of a push, and this has been going on nationwide for a few years, but it's starting to come to the Midwest to realize systems are supposed to fluctuate. There's supposed to be some natural variability. There's supposed to be low water years and high water years. And when we are consistently managing some of our water bodies at a consistent level year in and year out, decade after decade, you're losing that natural ecological variability, which favors some species and favors others. And so we're trying to reintroduce artificial natural variability into some of the systems. Right? And there's a human component too. If we were just managing for EWM, everyone knows how we could do that with water levels. We would drain the lake and desiccate the reservoir bed for quite some period of time. Well, that has impacts on other things like amphibians and reptiles. Property owners tend to want consistent water levels basically year-round. And that's another resource, that's another interest group that we have to try to balance. And so it's trying to get everyone together to realize there needs to be some variation and there's some sacrifices, whether it's by people, whether by certain plants, animals, critters. Depending on what we're trying to promote, there's going to be winners and losers. And it's just getting everyone to find consensus.
Thank you, Ben. And then back to Norm, working on a chain of lakes that's kind of in between these dams, right? It seems like you've got upstream issues and downstream issues, but you strategically started to say, let's go to the watershed, let's get out upstream and do these things. Has that been easy? How is the people that are on your Lake Association board, are they all on board with that, or what sort of challenges do you have?
Well, we do have some small dams, both upstream and downstream from us, but it's very minimal, and they're not large, they're not high-tech dams. If they need to raise or lower, they go and pull a board out, and then they put another board in if they want to raise it up higher. So they're small town dams, but they are managed. And downstream, the largest dam that I'm aware of is the one that's on the Turtle Flammable Flowage, which is huge. And that holds back, that controls a very large body of water. And I mentioned invasives in turtle flammable flowage already, but the average depth, I think, is somewhere around 10 feet or 12 feet in the turtle flammable flowage, at least in the area at the beginning. And from my understanding, some invasives really like those shallow water bodies and they can do well there. So what was the other part of your question about?
Well, I was just wondering, you said you explicitly wanted to go upstream and start working to prevent things from getting worse in your particular water body. You had to go upstream, but not everybody's comfortable stretching out and talking to neighbors and talking upstream.
Actually, what came of the study when we tried to reach outside the box or outside the boundaries of our lake was to create an awareness of all of the water bodies downstream and upstream from our lake, to understand that if we're not concerned about what's upstream from us, then others might think we're not concerned about what happens downstream from us. But we're very concerned about what leaves our lake and goes elsewhere, but we're also concerned about what's upstream that could possibly come down and end up in our lake as an invasive. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to broadcast an awareness of what's out there already in terms of invasive species, and also what's out there already in terms of problems within other lakes that we aren't experiencing, but they are, so that other lakes can share with each other. But getting back to the beginning of that, we're at the very start of trying to create that awareness. I mean, we actually started, we have one gentleman, Mike Scholdeis, who has been one of our members. He's been trying to broadcast it before we even had the lake management plan done. But now that voice has gotten louder, and we're hoping to broadcast it to more lakes, like I said, upstream and down. And like right now, the upstream lakes are most concerned about fish stocking, and not so much concerned about an invasive showing up.
Sure.
But I'm not sure all the different ways that an invasive could show up. I know water flowage is one of them, but there are other ways. Boats, wildlife, there's a lot of different ways it could happen. So it's not to say that somebody way upstream won't have a problem. They could certainly have a problem at some point. But right now we're not seeing any resistance, so to speak. We're seeing people that are actually quite thankful that we're getting the message out, and that they're aware that they're not even aware, some of them, that these other lakes have major problems, like the lake downstream that is curly-leaf pondweed. That pondweed was discovered in 2010, and it sat there for years, just getting thicker and thicker and thicker. And finally, 2 years ago, they did a massive harvesting of the pondweed, trying to get it out of the lake. But the problem was some of the pieces of that pondweed broke off and went downstream, and so now they're finding it in the next lake downstream and in the river downstream. And beyond that is the turtle flounder flowage, which is a prime fishery for anybody who likes to fish walleye. Now, we like to fish walleye too, but our lake was held as a study lake for many years by the Wisconsin DNR, so stocking was not allowed at any rate until the walleye population got down to something like 1.3 walleye per acre. Well, we got there, and there were no fishermen showing up. But part of it is part of the problem with invasives in terms of how they show up and how people could be concerned about it is through boat landings, when boats go in and out of lakes.
Yeah.
And a lot of lakes in different areas have put together, they've had people standing there doing inspections on boats as they come and go. But we're fortunate in that way. We have some private boat landings that people can put their vessels in, but our public boat landing is absolutely horrible, and we want to keep it that way.
Johnson, I'm going to bring Norm's strategy of going to the watershed to you and ask, are there examples locally of a watershed organization? Are there watershed associations in northern Wisconsin that would say, hey, they've kind of figured this out and we need to replicate that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would love, and I'm glad to get a chance to do this, Superior Rivers Watershed Association, Ashland, Bayfield area, are doing unbelievably amazing climate resiliency and climate adaptation projects. And I would encourage any lake association or water association that is dealing with the impacts from climate change and change in water regimes to reach out to them. And they work with a much larger partnership. And that's the other reason I would call on them. And so I think all of these questions and all of the answers have shown it is an issue of interconnectedness. And I think that is something that was broken, and I think trying to use that term standardize it is what happened, right? Everybody wanted their own pocket to be specific to them, and we're finding out that's not sustainable, right? So it is the interconnection, it's the willingness to have a dialogue and reach out. And so I hold that up because Superior Rivers then has a collaborative call with a number of federal agencies and local organizations every 2 months. So that's all I'd shout out to them, is that they are talking both ways and having regular communication with other organizations. I think that's how we get ahead of a lot of these problems.
Not to pick on that example, but that's a pretty big organization with staff and sort of a real program. Is there anything that's smaller scale that you can think of that's sort of like volunteer driven and people just recognizing like, hey, we could probably start thinking at a watershed scale?
So I'll point out it's not incorporated, but there is an organization called protecttheporkies.com. One of the dam projects that I am deeply involved in, or potential mining projects that I'm deeply engaged in, is a project called the Copperwood Mine. It is literally adjacent to Porcupine Mountain State Park. It sits on a hill that flows into Lake Superior. It's just the worst position you could have for a mine. So that organization is only a year old, but what they have done is they have kept everything done in an open fashion, meaning all of the meetings are open, all of the materials coming out of those meetings are shared. And this is another space, I think, or another thing to point out. Being open and engaging, right? I think, again, we're at this point where instead of trying to come up with our own solution, crowdsourcing, I'm calling out Protect the Porkies, and again, you can go to the website, because they have been using this, this overused phrase crowdsourcing. But what has happened is it started with one person and myself, and they now have over 42,000 people engaged on an online petition. We just delivered over 2,000 comments to the Michigan legislature. All of this being done for free through volunteers. And so my point is, think about your space in more open terms if you can, and you might just be surprised who comes into that space.
Yeah, and another way to crowdsource and use volunteers that I want to mention is the Water Action Volunteers program. How many people here are volunteers with Water Action Volunteers? So I got a few, and a lot of you are probably wondering, what the heck is he talking about? But a lot of you on a lake, you have a Citizens Lake Monitoring Network, you do SECI measurements, maybe you do chemistry sampling. We have a mirrored program that works with the moving waters, with the streams. And if you want to get out into the watershed, and I'd advise this for anyone in the turtle system, think about, do you have volunteers doing that regular water quality monitoring? You do have them? Great. It's definitely a low-hanging fruit as far as a practice to get going, because sometimes you're going to need, like Ben's talking about, you don't maybe need 100+ years of record, but you're going to want some multiple years of record to show whether there's a trend or whether there's consistency. It's the kind of thing that you could say when if a wetland was restored next to your lake and there was a stream connecting that wetland to the lake, you should be able to detect, wow, there was actually some improvements in water quality because the wetland itself is absorbing that stormwater and slowing things down, not pushing pollutants through. We're at a stage where I'm going to open it up to questions in the audience, and I'm told I have helpers. I have a helper with the mic here, and my helper with the mic here. So I guess we'll just see, we'll kind of pace out the helpers so that they're not stomping on each other, but I got a hand raised over here and a hand raised over here.
Hello?
And then we'll head over there. Jeff.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
My name is Jeff Meesman, and I'm with Last Wilderness Alliance. And I just wanted to make sure that you guys know we're going to have a meeting at 12:45 over in the Tamarack room. It's 110. We will be providing a light snack. The focus of the meeting will be hazardous wake boats and wake boat regulation. So far to date, we've helped 8 local municipalities, primarily in the North Woods, establish local control ordinances, and that equates to about 124 lakes. So in combination with the Lac du Flambeau tribe, which has got 97 named lakes under protection and another 100 unnamed lakes, we're making an effort in this, and we can show you guys how to do that. If you would attend that meeting, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. So that's sort of a correction to what I said earlier. That meeting won't happen concurrent with the county meetings. It happens subsequent to the county meetings. So thanks for making that clarification.
Right.
I got a mic over here in the back, I guess it's called.
My name is Bob Robinson. I'm a, is it on TV?
Yep.
Should be on. Retired fisheries biologist.
You turned it on.
Wrong here. It's on. Is it really?
Yes.
University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point grad. I'm going to make a statement and a question. I worked for the Department of Natural Resources in Notre State in the early 80s, tons of money. Fast forward 15 years, I was in St. Paul talking with some of the heads of the Department of Natural Resources, and at the end of the conversation they said, "Thank you very much, we just got 5 of your best biologists that started with us." And why was that? Is because of balancing the budget. The Scott Walker program basically had a mandatory furlough of a day that they didn't get paid, as well as a decrease in benefits. And so the question that I bring is that the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources is in a, keeping up with the theme, a dam situation. How do we, as citizens, get more money to fund these people that are working forever hours? And what's the best avenue to do that, I guess?
Sure. I'm going to hand that either to the board member from Wisconsin Wetlands or to Johnson from River Alliance. How do we interact with lawmakers to talk about these things?
Well, I could have paid you to set this up. So I have one specific mission today for nonprofit organizations. There is a federal filing called a 501H. It's a one-page document, takes 2 minutes to fill out, costs nothing to file with the IRS. Where I'm going with this is a bigger discussion. People often confuse or conflate lobbying to advocacy. Think of them in, I would say, wrong ways. They have this notion that, well, we're a nonprofit, we can't lobby. We're a nonprofit, we can't do advocacy. That is absolutely not true. If you talk to any well-respected organization that works with nonprofits, they will tell you you should be lobbying. And it's something that I would love, anybody in here who's interested in adding a lobby program to your organization, please reach out to me, because this is one of the big things we do. Wisconsin has an incredibly lenient system. You can lobby, your organization can lobby up to 4 days every 6 months with no records required. At the federal level, if you file this 501H document, one thing, it actually protects your organization if you want to engage in reaching out to elected officials and work on legislation. The other thing is that instant filing of the 501H form for your organization, it raises the amount of lobbying that you can do for your organization roughly 4-fold. So even without that filing, believe it or not, you are allowed to lobby a certain percentage. So again, I just want to break this false notion down. If you are a nonprofit, you should be lobbying, you should be engaging in the entire advocacy pie. And the final thing I will say is, all lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. And I say that because, again, this is a complete, it's run rampant through the nonprofit community since the 90s. There's a long reason for it. It involved some lawsuits and some legislation, but where it landed, nonprofits are encouraged to lobby. There are very easy, clear guidelines for it, but it has become this like huge monster in a lot of organizations' minds. But again, that's what I would say is make sure your organization understands and is engaging in lobbying, because as a nonprofit, you absolutely have the right to do that. And there are some really simple things you can do to magnify your ability to make a difference on reaching out to elected officials. Another weird thing, even if you're an executive director of a nonprofit, you are allowed to engage with the elected officials that represent your home area. You can engage as an executive director with no limits. It's just, there's some weird local things in Wisconsin that actually make it even easier for you to engage. But I'm happy to, again, offline, follow up further about that. Also, I would say organizations may not be engaging in Get Out the Vote. That is another huge area that nonprofits across the United States should be. And if you engage with consultants, they're going to tell you your nonprofit should have a Get Out the Vote aspect to your advocacy work. There's no restrictions on that. This is another miscommunication or area where people get confused. Electioneering, that's totally different. Stay away from candidates, stay away from elections, you're fine. But in terms of the lobbying, in terms of the talking with people about issues, totally go for it.
And we've had lawmakers come to the Wisconsin Lakes and Rivers Partnership Convention in the past and ask them to kind of explain how should citizens be advised. And the number one consistent thing, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, they say, get to know your lawmaker, talk to them, meet them, go to their events, introduce yourself, but become on more of they recognize your face and they know who you are. It doesn't work, I'm just replicating what they say, it doesn't work just to show up and make demands on your first visit. They want to know a little bit about you and where you're from, and they want you to know about them and where they're from. So don't put off getting to know a lawmaker.
And just a quick addendum, the reason for that, the reason I encourage you all, if you're not talking to your lawmakers, because I was a registered lobbyist for a decade, I guarantee you the people you don't want talking to them are talking to them every single day. So if you're not countering that, that's how we end up in these scenarios. I just had to throw that out.
We got a question in the back.
I'm from the Friends of Jersey Flowage Association, and we are basically below Nokomis and above the Mohawkson. And kind of to give you an example, like what Norm was talking about before with water flow, we looked because we have the curly pondweed and some of that stuff in our waterway. And we looked at, doing different treatments or picking or harvesting, things like that. And one of the things that we had thought about doing was the treatment. But the water flow for us is a 3-day turnaround. Basically, every drop of water in the Tomahawk River and Jersey flowage comes in and goes out in 3 days. So we found that any treatment we would do would be doing nothing more than treating Mohawks. So just to kind of give you an example of when you're thinking about what you're doing and what it affects above and below you, that's one way to look at it. I mean, look at what your water flow is, because it's outstanding. You can think you're doing yourself good and it's going to do nothing at all.
Yeah, a lot of this water is moving, and of course, this time of year, the kind of year we've been having right now, it's moving a lot. Yeah,
right.
So you got to think about your downstream neighbors. We got a question over.
The second question
Sure.
I had was for Jim. We have a pond, marsh, whatever you want to call it, or could call it. You were talking about the regulations for trying to reinstitute it or refresh it. What would I have to do to find out what I needed to do in order? Because I mean, about 5 years ago you could drive across it with a four-wheeler, no problem. Right now you're probably almost waist-high grass. It's wet, you'd bury a four-wheeler in it. But we'd like to get it back to a stage where it could be a pond for the deer, for wildlife. It's in the middle of 140 acres of land that we have. And I just, we'd like to kind of refresh that and get it back. What would be involved in that?
Well, I would suggest to start with your county land conservationist and talk to them, and they could point you in the right direction if there are some programs available for that. It's hard to say. I mean, it depends. If it's an artificially created pond, you may not be able to do much with outside funding. You may be on your own. If it's a naturally occurring wetland, there's probably opportunities there from other sources of funding to do restoration work for you. But your county land conservationist would be the first place to start on that.
Okay.
Great. Over here.
And Tom's sitting right down over here, so that's Lincoln County. Right down here. Got to call Tom up.
Give him a phone call.
Hi there.
I think it's working.
Is it working now?
Yep.
Okay. So also on the topic of CLP, I'm with North Lakeland Discovery Center. We've been out on the water removing invasives and talking about the flow of aquatic invasives downstream. You had mentioned your CLP had sat there for 10 years or so, or curly leaf pondweed, my bad. And that when you were removing it, some of it went downstream. I guess I just wanted to clarify a bit on the part of the life cycle of curly leaf pondweed it is going to show up downstream because part of its life cycle is to create a winter bud, or it's called a turion, and it's sending it a little part of itself downstream to go establish new colonies. So it very well could have been that while you were pulling it, some of it was released and spread, but I just wanted to clarify that within the 10 years that it had already been there, it was probably already spreading and making its way down.
Yes, the lake that currently has curly leaf pondweed, or the first one that we knew had it, they're like 4 lakes downstream from us. So you may be aware of them at Rice Lake. Are you aware of that outbreak in Rice Lake?
I'm not sure, I'm a little new to the area. There's a lot of lakes.
Rice Lake, so it just sat there for many years. Nobody did anything about it, but it had been moving downstream from there at that point, like you said. But once they did the Herculean removal of the pondweed, they were using different methods, including pulling it. I think there was some effort of hooking a chain to one side and then another side and then trying to saw it off manually. But what happened with that is it broke into small pieces and then they were finding it all over downstream.
So it's kind of like just grinding it up and not really catching all the small bits?
They're looking at purchasing some kind of a harvester. So that's the Rice Lake Association. So our association is not directly involved in that, but we've had a lot of our people go down and volunteer time trying to help remove it. But now it's it's in the Turtle River downstream from Rice Lake, and it's also now in Pike Lake and beyond Pike Lake. So
yeah, I think that's excellent to hear about, like the process that they were doing that, and that it was essentially, in such a way where it's like, yeah, it's going to directly be exposed downstream if they're trying to remove it in that way, and why you would want to get involved with how they're removing it upstream.
Yeah, downstream from Pike Lake is Lake of the Falls, and it's not there yet. But if it ever gets to Lake of the Falls, it's only a short distance to the turtle flambeau, or the turtle flambeau flowage, which is monstrous body of water.
Thank you.
Got the person in front.
Norm, does Spider Lake not even have rusty crayfish? Is it that?
Yeah, the only thing we have, based on the study, and it was a study that went over almost about 2.5 years. We hired OCLRA. I don't know if you've ever heard of OCLRA before, but OCLRA did a massive study, and a lot of our people were volunteering to be part of that as well. And the only thing they found, which we knew about already because we were working on pulling it each year before it comes to seed, is purple loosestrife. That's the only thing we have at this point. And we're extremely thankful, and we're probably one of the reasons, we're not the only ones. The lakes that are upstream from us have nothing, but maybe a couple of them have purple loosestrife. But as I said before, we're thank the Lord every day for that horrible boat landing, because that does keep the traffic down.
Tom's got a question in front.
So this is for Ben and Joanne. One of the reasons the Superior watershed is so vibrant is because they had to deal with a 12 to 15 inch rainfall event in a 24-hour period. And I'm wondering how well positioned we are in the Northwoods here for an event like that, both for culverts and dams.
And I'll kind of ask Ben, when you mentioned doing all these scenario models, do you have to now start including some really high precipitation models and trying to predict we have much better computer systems, digital maps, terrain maps. We can kind of pretend to have a rain event before we actually have it. What are your models suggesting? Are there problem areas?
Yeah, so that's one of the benefits of being a federally regulated dam, or a FERC regulated dam, is that you're continually assessing for public safety and potential for loss of life. And so on those facilities, there's certain dams that if they fail, all of the models show water levels are going to come up, but there really won't be a drastic impact to human life or property. And so those dams are treated differently than what are considered high hazard dams. And so for the high hazard dams, what we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years, because of some of these large climatic events or weather events, is you're seeing some of the national entities, your USGS, your National Weather Service, your NOAAs, they're updating what is the 5-year storm event, what is the 100-year storm event, what is the 1,000-year storm event. And so you're seeing those change, but then the modeling capabilities are also changing. And so right now, we're in the process of continually going through for our high hazard dams, analyzing storms that you can't even can't even fathom, that exceed 10, 12, 15 inches, in a short period of time. But I think it would come of no surprise that culverts infrastructure is not designed for the types of storms we're talking about. So we have to model and plan for it and then make adaptations to be able to withstand that. And a great example of that right now at our Rice Dam, also known as Lake Nokomis in Tomahawk, just above the Jersey, we've got a multi-million-dollar project going on the dam to be able to withstand larger inflows that may come in the future. They're not likely, but when the models show there's the potential for that, it's up to dam owners, infrastructure owners to put in mitigation in place and to do that. Now I'll let Joanne talk about the problem with the infrastructure is that culverts and road projects have pretty minimum state standards that do not factor in high extreme rain events. So.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add because I didn't really do any modeling. I was doing assessments of existing culverts and some bridges, but I would just add that with 75% of them being classified as undersized, we're not sitting in a good position to prevent that sort of thing.
I think some of what I've seen is in Ashland County and Bayfield County, they've been able to do sort of, they're trying to assess which culverts are most likely to be lost in the case of a very large rain event, so that they can prioritize that resizing and trying to get the size a little bit better. But also then what they did, I think they call it like a risk and loss analysis, where they start quantifying the dollars of real estate, for example, that could be inundated or swept out too if a storm got really bad. So look up at the Northwest Regional Planning Commission, I think has some of these reports out there that summarize sort of the risk and loss analysis of where they could lose those. Even just losing those culverts is a waste of money, and then it's the road infrastructure itself that gets wiped away. That's all money as well.
And public safety.
Question in the back center.
My name is Jack Grezik. I live on Crescent Lake in Oneida County. At one time, not too long ago, our lake was terribly infested with rusty crayfish. In a matter of 1 year, they got a liver disease and they're all gone. Is there a reason we can't introduce that liver disease to the other lakes that have the problem?
I mean, usually you empty your beer before you rinse it in the water, so I don't know how you got liver disease in here. Crayfish. I don't know. Is anybody familiar with this? Is there any AIS experts in the room that know something about what actually went down on this lake?
There are a number of lakes in the Northwoods that are experiencing the same thing. I live in Big Bearskin, and we're down to we trap intensively. We're down to 10% of what we normally trap.
Wow.
In Trout Lake, Noah can talk a little bit about Trout Lake.
Yeah, we've seen the same thing in Trout Lake, and actually a PhD student from the University of Florida did her dissertation on it. Carol, are you still back up here somewhere? I'm trying to remember. It's some like microsporidian bacteria, it's fungal that gets into them, and it's caused their population to crash in Trout Lake as well. We're seeing resurgence in the natural macrophytes and things like that. You can tell if they're infected if you can catch them. They tend not to be easily caught in traps once they're infected because they don't move around very much. But when you look at the bottom side of them, when you flip them upside down, they get like a kind of a milky white color.
Someone with their hand up here, and I'll add a comment to this. Is anyone in the room over 120 years old? Close. Getting close. Humans have this innate kind of a built-in sense of time frames, right? We can only understand usually what we've experienced ourselves personally. Maybe we read some anecdotes, and even there, that doesn't go back very long. The types of natural variations that we're talking about, the things that we observe, it all seems like a crisis to us, but on a geological timescale, this is just a blip. These invasive species and things like that. I'm not saying that every invasive species should just be accepted and dealt with, but we all need to, I think, temper our expectations about what's going to happen because there's going to be lots of variation. Question front here. Somewhere in the back first, and then up here.
Yeah, this question's for Ben. You mentioned FERC a couple times. When is the next look-in, and do you know anything that's going to be on the agenda?
last part first, everything's on the agenda pretty much every 5 years. So we got our original license in 1996, updated management plans in 2001, 2006, 2011, 2016, 2021. So next up is 2026. And we typically start that process in January, send out information to all of the agencies, lake associations, districts, public. Anyone that wants to participate is more than welcome. That'll usually start in January. We'll send out kind of some current plans, some updates to plans, have some back and forth, and that's typically like a 5-6 month process before everything gets submitted to FERC in July. And all of that public comment process is all public. That all gets submitted and included, and responses too. So similar to the Department of Natural Resources when they amend master management plans and things. It's a very interactive public process. It's all there for the viewing.
Gentleman in front.
Yeah, hello, Brian Good, Fisher Lake, Norm's neighbor to the north. First, a comment and a question. I was volunteered to be the new president of our association last year. Our association has been in existence for over 10 years now, and yes, the original purpose was to improve the fishery. But since then, we've had a group of volunteers on our lake that have been very enthusiastic about helping the water, and so a little defense for our association. We have groups of volunteers out there that have been trained by the DNR. We are actually placing buoys out in the lake if we see something that looks like an invasive species and it's being monitored because we care about our neighbors to the south. Besides providing walleye to our 3 lakes. We actually recently had a board meeting that was kind of contentious with spending our money for stocking walleye or holding a little bit back for a possible emergency that might happen in the future. So there is definitely a feel on our lake that everybody loves the fish, but we can't fish if we don't have a lake to fish on. So we have a large group, 3 lakes are part of our chain, which then leads down the Turtle River to Spider Lake. So we are definitely more conscious that there's more to the lake than just fishing. So just defending my little baby.
Appreciate that.
Sorry, but no, my question actually is, and again, forgive my naiveness because I'm just recently new to this position. We've always been asked the question of what about dams? Beaver dams. We've talked about wetlands here, so maybe this is a message for a question for Jim or one of you guys on the group, or maybe somebody in the audience. We're upriver from us is Party Creek, which that organization has. Party Lake has been part of a study you guys have been doing, and you found some things up there. Well, we're protected by about a half dozen beaver dams on that creek. And we've asked, our association's been asked, can we remove these beaver dams? And that's well beyond my scope. So I'd like to know if there's anything that can be done about beaver dams, if anyone on the panel can discuss that or somebody in the audience. Thank you.
I can address it a little bit. From the quality water that you send down to us goes through about keep sending those fish. Problem is there's like 4 beaver dams between Shays Dam, which is downstream from you before Spider Lake. And that same question came up, what about beaver dams? Is that affecting the water? Last year when the water level was real low, I was getting calls left and right from people saying, we got to get rid of those beavers because they're making our lake low and the water's not coming back. And so I said, I think, and I don't know all about the new math, but I think that once the beaver dam fills up, the water flow is still the same as it was before. So I put them in contact with Jenna Malinowski. She's our local DNR biologist in Mercer. And but she said same thing. She said it's not to worry. Somebody privately went in there and removed the beaver dams, but it wasn't done with a permit or anything. But that's all I can tell you about it.
And they call beavers nature's engineers for a reason, and just like human dams, Beaver dams are the same way. It's not a black and white issue that they are all good or all bad. It depends where they're placed and the ecological implications. You can find research and studies promoting beaver dams or talking about all the devastating impacts of them. And so it's really case-specific, watershed-specific, and that's where reach out to your local biologists and see how that's impacting your particular lake. There are no blanket statements for beaver dams because we deal with hundreds of them throughout the Wisconsin River watershed and have various agreements with APHIS and other entities. Some need to be managed and some don't.
I think there's also a change in the mindset regarding beaver to some extent. They are part of the natural system. They are nature's engineers. Historically, prior to white settlement, there were beavers everywhere in the upper Midwest and throughout the really northern part of North America. And they do have a significant role in hydrologic restoration and maintenance and all that kind of things, regulating stream flows and so on. I was at a conference a few years ago in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon, and they're actively restoring, trying to reestablish beaver populations out there for the benefit of salmon reproduction in the tributaries to the major rivers. So that's just one example, a little different system out there than we have, but yeah, they do have their place, that's for sure. And they do cause a lot of problems. So as Ben says, there's situations where you can't tolerate them, but there's a lot of places where don't look at them initially or immediately as a problem. They're probably not a problem. They're probably beneficial.
I think we have time for just one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap things up. So,
my name is Andy Rich, and I actually am running for Senate 12 against Mary Felskowski. I want to thank Johnson Bridgewater. I got involved in water activism 8 years ago with the metallic sulfide mine on the Menominee River. So thank you for the River Alliance's work to help us with that issue. It's crucial. But my question is for Joanne. Are our current replacements being assessed for culverts to ensure that we aren't continuing the bad practice of installing or replacing culverts that aren't sufficient for their placement location today? Or is your work for the future?
Yeah, so the question is, are these new culverts right-sized for what could be in the future?
That's a hard, well, usually they're not replaced with what is ideal. And they're rarely replaced with what's ideal, and that's largely due to the cost. So we have this point in time, a current assessment of what these culverts look like, what these crossings look like, and we've tried to work with towns and the highway department and different organizations, but a lot of times we don't get called till they've blown out. And then the funding is difficult to obtain because grants need to be written well in advance, like a year in advance. So I would say at this point, it's been really difficult to encourage or actually see in real time a larger structure being placed. So it's not a happy story, sorry.
And the culverts and roads are basically, that's our hard infrastructure, and increasingly people are talking about our green infrastructure. And really anything you can do upstream from a road crossing or a culvert to slow down runoff, to encourage it to infiltrate, that actually is going to save you money downstream on your hard infrastructure. So every wetland that gets restored, every rain garden that gets put into somebody's yard, every time you figure out ways to just keep water on your property, just to slow it down is going to be to everyone's benefit. I'll give a shameless plug for the Healthy Lakes and Rivers page. If you haven't gone to Healthy Lakes and Rivers, there's ways the DNR can actually cost share these practices. It's going to get even easier in the future to access those Healthy Lakes and Rivers grants. So if you're not familiar with that, come talk to me. I also want to plug the newsletter up here, the conference we have coming up next spring. But I want to ask you all to please give our panelists a good round of applause for the excellent. Next slide. So again, this is what happens next, so I hope you'll bear with us. We do have these meetings that take place roughly from 12 to 12:30 for the different counties. And then the last Wilderness Alliance meeting is going to happen subsequent to those but in that same space that's identified there. So thank you all for your time today. Thank you for everything you do for lakes, and we'll see you next year.